back to 2002.
Okay, welcome everybody. It's just about showtime here. We got everybody here, so I think we should get going. It's there's a lot of information there that we're going to have to go through. Some will be faster than others. There was a discussion that we might want to. I don't know. How's everybody feel? Anyway, let's open the meeting and the approval of the agenda. Now, what we were thinking is we might move the. Proposed planning and development procedure bylaw discussion. And the housekeeping, is that the way the other one? Which are pretty low hanging fruit, eh? We've already been through all that stuff.
2.3 and 2.4?
Yeah,
Well,
I
we
just
haven't
wondered.
been through 2.3, but
Well, I think we have, haven't we, or not? No, I think. So how about 2.4? And we'll just go through that because it's just a rehashing of what we had.
Sure. I mean, I know I had 2.1 first in part because two people from the Housing Advisory Committee were here.
Well, they're here,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're here, so I thought.
Well, we don't want to bore them to death, do we?
I've blocked out the 2 hours, so I'm,
Okay.
yeah,
well,
I'm here.
but you
No,
don't-
let's do that and then we'll skip over to the
Well,
2.4.
we could do
and go back.
2.4 as 2.2,
Yeah.
renumber 2.2.
So let's just, we'll just free range that.
Why are we shifting things around?
Well, it was my suggestion because I think we're gonna get punchy by what, 6:15, 6:30, and wanna go home. And
But that's
I
when we
don't want
actually need to
2.4 to be deferred because we've already been through it and had a draft bylaw and everything. And I thought that would be the low-hanging fruit to get off the table. And it'll really
I
help.
think we should just
that.
stick with the
Okay,
agenda. I
just
move
go with
adoption of the agenda.
And I did too.
There might be
Okay,
other
so you've
people
approved
coming.
the agenda, you've seconded it, all in favor? Okay, we're sticking with the original
Yeah,
then.
well,
And opposed. Councilor Morris in opposition.
I'll
Did I say
take it.
Morris?
Well, there could be other people too who are looking at the agenda.
Yeah.
Presentation, secondary suites review. Robyn, Fenton.
Is that me?
Yeah, that's you
No, I was
already.
actually
Come on up.
presenting today.
So,
Okay.
I actually have like a presentation ready.
Okay,
Robyn's the
well,
easiest,
Robyn,
so-
just sit yourself
Yeah.
there, we'll just.
I'll be here for
yeah,
questions.
Thank you.
Surprise.
Yeah. So this report came from work done by the Housing Advisory Committee. So just for reference, their terms of reference say that they will provide advice and recommendations to council on a wide range of housing issues, including review of planning initiatives, bylaws, and policy development. So they have been working this past year on reviewing our existing bylaws and identified secondary suite regulations as a good first step to bring a report and recommendations to council. So just by way of some background, so secondary suites were permitted on Bowen in 2008 and detached secondary suites in 2017. And I just pulled some numbers to show what the impact has been. So we've seen the last 5 years, 27 secondary suites built on Bowen. I have here our end of year building permits show 6 detached secondary suites. And the star here is that we've had a fair number of people build what will in the future be their detached secondary suite. It's probably our most common thing where people build a small house on their property that would qualify as a detached secondary suite. It means they can get the development permit done with their plan being in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, they're going to build a big house. And this will now be a detached secondary suite. So it's sometimes a little hard to track, but we were 6 that were built as detached secondary suites. And this is smaller, but it's essentially
Sorry, there were
Yeah.
6 that were built under that.
as the detached secondary suite.
Yeah.
So they had already had a house and they
Yeah.
built the detached secondary
But
suite.
they're not in those numbers.
No, those are the 6 that were built, as opposed to the ones we've had where people built just the like what will in the future. be
Okay, and how many of those were?
I didn't look at those, I just looked
Okay.
at this morning to give you
Okay,
numbers.
no worries.
So what you're saying is those detached secondary suites that have been built, not all of them are on a lot that has 2 houses on it.
No, so these 6 were all built as the second dwelling on a lot.
Okay, so there's 2 dwellings on each lot for the.
Yeah, for those 6, but there's other ones that where they built just the small one first, and they intend to in future build what will be, and then they will have a detached
Other than
secondary
the
suite.
small one where they built the big one and so.
Yeah. So just by way of background, these are our existing accessory residential use regulations, and then I'll go through each one. So the Housing Advisory Committee made a recommendation basically for each point, so point by point, but it's just to have it all in one place. There's essentially these 7 points of how we regulate accessory residential use, which is how our land use bylaw defines attached secondary suite or detached secondary suite. We say they're both an accessory residential use, and then the regulations flow from there. So the first is, most basically, we allow one attached residential, accessory residential use, so one secondary suite attached or detached on a lot. So the Housing Advisory's recommendation is to consider relaxing that, so maybe allowing one attached and one detached, or allowing two attached suites within one property. And then they have some sub-points to that, so they control maybe through a development permit process or with size limits on it. But for council to consider relaxing that one accessory residential use regulation.
Daniel, as you go through each one, could you provide any of your comments?
Sure.
Robyn,
I
at the end, okay,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, and I was gonna ask council too, how the best, do you want to go through each, you wanna go point one and we'll talk about point one more and go to point two, or would you rather me go through everything?
I think go through them all.
Okay.
I just want to hear your comments, whether you do them all at the end or do them, so I don't know.
But these are the comments from the
Yes.
housing
Yes,
report.
this is the Housing Advisory Committee
Yes.
report, exactly. I mean, I think with this one in particular, I remember this being a discussion when council allowed detached secondary suites in the first place. There was a debate whether to have it as an and or an or. At the time it was or, but with the thinking that, okay, at some point in the future, maybe that would be something we want to look at. I mean, I know one of the bigger considerations with this is water use, and how we're wondering that. And so in essence, when we did detached secondary suites, we didn't have to worry about it to the same extent, because we're saying, well, right now you're allowed a secondary suite, and again, have a detached secondary suite instead of. So we're not worrying about adding a dwelling to the property, but we're splitting it out. I know that Salt Spring has recently done something where they're allowing, in essence, detached secondary suites. And they went through their bylaw and they did it on specific properties, and they said, these are all not in a water district, and they're not, right? They sort of did this whole analysis, and they said, okay, these properties are allowed to have it. And maybe that's something similar, we say, okay, we can't do it in places where we know there's water issues, but places where there is water, then it's okay. The next one is the parking requirement, which says for each accessory residential use, each secondary suite, you need to have a parking space. And so the Housing Advisory Committee is that look at a way to allow some flexibility on this, so it doesn't limit suite creation. So in particular, thinking of smaller lots that don't have the parking, that are maybe closer to the cove or closer to transit use. Other ways to allow that, or ways to allow smaller parking spaces. So then we currently have a clause that says if you have a bed and breakfast or a commercial guest accommodation, you're not allowed an accessory residential use of a secondary suite, and the Housing Advisory Committee recommends removing that, and I would agree. I think we found through the business license processing that if people currently have a secondary suite and a bed and breakfast on their property, and they're told you have to choose one or the other, people are choosing bed and breakfast over secondary suite every time, basically. So
That's not good.
so this one, then just
Could you go back for a second? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So this is the maximum size of the detached secondary suite, which is this formula based on the size of the lot with a maximum of 115 square meters, and that is an advisory committee said, okay, no changes needed on that one. And then the next one is the minimum size of a lot on which you can have a detached secondary suite. So 0.36 hectares is about 9/10 of an acre. And so the committee recommended the lot size requirement, and then mirroring that with more intensive development permit process. So currently we have a development permit for detached secondary suites, but it's fairly broad, right? It just says there's a couple points about landscaping, and a couple points about shadowing and views and that sort of thing. But looking at, as you get into smaller areas, you get more stringent development permit criteria, to the point where it may not be possible in all of places. Like currently, if you have a lot that's 0.36 hectares, you can probably figure out a way you're going to fit a detached secondary suite on it. You can kind of do it as a outright. Though it means you get smaller. Well, maybe we allow it on any small size because maybe your small lot is in the middle of nowhere and you're fine. But maybe on smaller lots, it's just not going to function and it's not going to work. And then the last two are about the size of a secondary suite. So currently, our bylaw, like most bylaws in BC, have this maximum floor area of 90 square meters and not occupying more than 40% of the floor area. And those were because that was in the BC building code, had those same numbers in it. So it was easier for every municipality just to mimic the same numbers and say, okay, now it's a secondary suite and it has these same maximums. The new BC building code removes those regulations. So we're no longer held by that. So the committee recommends removing both of them, those regulations.
Are there So is Greg around today so he can tell us what changes there are in the basic building code? I mean, what's,
Yeah, I mean, I have there's like a 50-page PDF that they have the technical changes that I've
and
gone
all
through.
that's for
Separation.
the secondary suites?
No, just a section of it. But so yeah, so the building code allows secondary suites, and essentially what that means is limited, like more relaxed requirements on the fire separation stuff, as opposed to it being a suite within a building. So if you have like a building with multiple suites, it's different than if you have a secondary suite. But essentially, yeah, it used to say, the secondary suite could be no more than 40% of the floor area, and that requirement is gone.
And
you
so
could-
there's no requirement?
Yeah,
It
so-
could be the same size or?
Yeah. And same with the maximum size, it's no longer there. They have a whole bunch of really complicated language about how it works now in townhouses and row houses and stuff, is it as applicable to
Yeah.
us, and you need vertical separation or horizontal separation and all those pieces, but for our practice, in the BC building code, a secondary suite, you could, a 2,000 square foot, you could have essentially two 2,000 square foot dwelling units within the building. One's the detached, or one's the secondary suite, and one's the main house.
The
and that
upstairs
would
and
be-
the downstairs.
Yeah, and that
Or
would be,
almost side by side or something. And what about fire separation or plumbing codes, no changes for any of that? Or
not that I'm aware of, so
have
it's
you
still
blocked
like,
off entry
yeah.
and all that stuff? And
I think it exists as it does now in terms of, I'm not 100% familiar, but like what is required for a secondary suite versus for a suite.
I guess my sort of trouble with all of it is how do you convert an existing house that's just set up as one big house where you just wander
Yeah.
from one room to the next and common hallways and everything into a house with a secondary suite without getting a building permit?
Yes, you would need a building permit to
Yeah.
convert, to build a secondary suite, you would need a
Or
building
to
permit.
convert,
Yeah, and it does require, fire separation, so the distinction in the building code is that a secondary suite has less fire separation needed than if you were to build, say, like a duplex, meaning like a stratified unit, has a higher level of separation required than a secondary suite.
Yeah.
But
What's the rationale for that? Not that it matters, but,
For the building code changes?
well, no, it just seems kind of odd that we
lesser
have.
fire
Oh, that's fire.
Fire separation. You guys are part of the, part of the living
part of the
space,
house.
as opposed to a separate.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know. Okay, anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, so that's it.
Does it need a separate entrance? Do you know?
It needs a separate entrance, and I can't remember if a secondary suite is allowed one entrance that splits.
Right,
You know,
okay,
you have-
yeah, it doesn't matter for this, anyway, thank you.
And so definitely with the 40% space limit, so we've seen some houses on Bowen that are essentially, right, you build an upstairs, downstairs, and they're under the 90 square meter limit, but we would say, well, that's not allowed to be a detached, or not allowed to be a secondary suite because it's 50% of the floor area. But it seems kind of an arbitrary regulation, like, does it matter if you build two 800 square foot things? Seems like it should be it. We discussed with the housing advisory committee, if we're moving the 90 square meter maximum, or is it, increasing it to a different limit that we think is appropriate? So, sort of something for council to consider. And, is the idea of having a 2,000 square foot secondary suite in a larger house, does that fit? Is that what you're allowed the floor, or you could build, if you could build a 5,000 square foot house with a 1,000 square foot secondary suite, does it matter if it's now a 2,000 square foot secondary suite and a 4,000 square foot house? Is it?
So in
Or to
seven-
the first point, a 4,000 square foot house and two 1,000 square foot suites.
Right.
That was the first point,
Yeah.
was like,
Yeah.
you can build this huge thing, if you've got the water and sewer capacity, like,
Yeah.
why not build those other things?
So that was sort of my question about the building permit, because when you apply for a building permit, they will ascertain whether you've got adequate water and sewer. So I don't understand the DP process for water and sewer.
Yeah, some of that thing, I guess, is in terms of if we increase the zoning, and particularly thinking of like municipal water districts.
But if you apply for a building permit, you're gonna have to prove that there's adequate, that you can connect and get more water.
So we do it like if you are a house in Blue Water, like a vacant lot in Blue Water, and you get your building permit, they want a
Yeah.
Blue Water district.
Yeah.
And I'm not clear how much rationale we'd have to say, no, you can't build your property here in the district, but we're gonna refuse you
But a DP process, I mean, there's, just thinking about the water district, some of them have some bylaws and stuff that if you're adding another, a suite or,
Yeah.
2 meters and stuff like that. But
Yeah, but you're right, like it may not be a development permit process.
with,
but it would
with
be
the
like
sewer,
through
definitely,
zoning.
if you're adding, bedroom, I mean, it's all based on
Yeah,
the number of
it'd be-
Well,
bedrooms and
especially if
bathrooms
you're
are
in
already
Cove Bay
there.
or something like that, I mean,
Yeah.
there is an increase in usage in the sewer system, there's no question about that.
But then there's the other part, just the on-site sewer system, is it added?
Well, that's also a question that would have to be, that's part of the building permit process.
Is it though?
I just, if I might just for a second, I mean, I read through all this and I'm going, wow, this is a wholesale opening up of the, sort of the whole secondary suite thing and that, and trying to pump a whole bunch more. I wonder what the rationale was for, just more housing?
Do you want to speak to that, Robyn? Sorry, for our recommendations
Yeah.
or for the review in general?
From the recommendations, but the review is a wholesale opening up of the whole system again.
Yeah, and we were motivated to review because I think, Daniel, you were undertaking it. From memory, it was in 2017 when the detached secondary suite bylaw was approved. It was let's check in 2 years
Yeah.
and see how it went. So we were aware that Daniel at planning would be doing a review. So we said, hey, why don't we time a review of ours from our lens?
Yeah.
And I can't remember, Daniel, I don't think it got included. We sort of have this little phrase that we're now putting at the beginning of each things, is that as the Housing Advisory Committee, our overarching goal is to facilitate the development of diverse housing options
Yeah.
from low to moderate income. So that's where we as a Housing Advisory Committee come from, right? So that's our goal. So then that was the lens that we looked at all of these through. And that's why there are suggestions, recommendations from our point of view as the Housing Advisory Committee. And I did provide a rationale, so I'm happy to go back to any of them and read it out. And like I say, there's 2 or 3 of these that I think are just kind of low hanging fruit. They're just slam dunks, like the one to align with the building code. I think
Yeah.
that's pretty easy. One, we said no change. Like I think the maximums you've got in general are fine. I don't think we have to go crazy big with suites or anything like that. I don't, unless council really wants to, that's, we don't need to open that up. And then I think there's some, sorry?
You don't want to open up the 40% or the 90%?
No, the 40% and the 90 limit, which were aligned with the code,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
get rid of them, align with the new code, I think that's an easy one. I think that earlier, and sorry, Daniel, I can't remember, one of the earlier ones is about overall limits to the sizes, and sorry, I can't remember this one. So number 4, so this detached secondary suite shall not exceed a total area of, 65 square meters plus whatever percentage up to a maximum. So it's
Okay,
like,
well, that's detached.
yeah, so
I
1,200 square feet,
you know,
that's fine. And then, yeah, so and in terms of attached, then you start to just go, like when you build a house on Bowen, most of the sites, some are controlled by floor space ratio, but most are controlled by site coverage and height limits. So we, again, kind of what we just said a few minutes ago, if you have a fairly big lot and you can build a 6,000 square foot, building, does it matter if it's a 6,000 square foot house, a 4,000 square foot house with a 2,000 square foot, suite, 4,000 with 1,000 and 1,000, like, does that really matter? As long as you can prove water, sewer, parking, all of that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where we came from. And I know Fritz did quite a bit of work on this and he had a really nice set of diagrams which might come out in a subsequent report that we might work on, but that was sort of the rationale behind it. And then I know there's a couple in here that are likely more controversial. So we just put in our
I think
our
the overall impact
recommendations.
on the neighborhood is another thing. I mean, we just can't
Absolutely.
just open it up sort of Wild West and say,
No.
hey, come on.
And that's why, sorry, Maureen, I'll just jump in with this last point. That's why in most of them, that's why we suggested the DP process, so that it isn't just a free-for-all. That, and again, I don't know quite enough about the process, is how, if you leave subjectivity in there or not. But, I'm imagining most of the lots in Deep Bay, if you remove the site limitation, size limitation, this couldn't do it. There's physically no space between their septic systems and their parking requirements, that. So it's not like it just opens it up and all of a sudden everybody's installing these attached suites everywhere, but it gives some flexibility to those other neighborhoods that have the 1/4 acre, the 1/2 acre sites that actually probably could get a small thing in or something on top of the garage or whatever it is. So it's just, again, from the lens of the Housing Advisory Committee, which is to create more of these options. And right now they're limited to large lots, generally far from the code. Could we open that up to smaller lots hopefully near the cove. And again, one of the things we suggested was maybe there's a limitation that it has to be near a transit line or near trails or something, that, you know, you're not allowing them in those areas that aren't served by transit, but you're saying, okay, you can do it on these smaller lots, but you have to be within 500 meters of a transit line, or whatever, something along those lines might be that, you know, yeah, so. Sorry, Maureen.
To your point, just before I go to you, Maureen, just to your point, I think it's well said that we did say we'd look at this in 2 years and see that, you know, are we prohibiting more secondary suites because of the regulation?
Yeah.
And is there pressure out there to open it up, Maureen?
Yeah. Robyn touched on a lot of the points that I would have made. And the first one is that I don't see this as a wholesale opening up.
Okay.
What I see it as is a more site-specific approach to the appropriateness of secondary suites. And I think that there are all sorts of advantages to that. One of the criticisms that I received of the current version of the secondary suites was what it did was it essentially enabled sprawl, in that we would permit secondary suites on large properties far from the cove that might have a lot of transportation challenges, whereas a smaller lot that is in the cove that would draw on the existing resources for water and sewer, but would nonetheless include, would enhance the density in the cove, could actually be a much more appropriate approach to this.
So,
Well, a couple of things. One of them, Robyn, you asked the question, what would be the difference in putting a bigger house? And I think there's something special about islands, and where most I think our buildings are getting huge for islands. For an island scale. And however, that's not specific to low and moderate housing needs. That's mostly waterfront homes and those really big, expensive ones. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue for here, but I think there is an issue around size and scale for some neighborhoods. And however, I think about Europe, where there are little clusters of old farm buildings that have a few families living in them. Not saying it's not appropriate, but I wonder about protecting our island's character in neighborhoods. And so, you know, but that's partly because you just drew it like a big box, and I know it doesn't have to be a big box. I also am concerned about the sprawl aspect, and I was back when we first passed these, including, you know, giving permission for a lot of the big waterfront lots to have houses, and the loss of the forest that goes with that in the face of ongoing, just ongoing development pressure and changes to our island that we might want to protect. And so I take your point about the sprawl. I've heard that too, and I would like to find a way to, if we're going to double again the amount of, it would be a huge density increase for the island, right?
yeah.
Is
Awesome.
And I agree with keeping the diversity of housing. We need that, but I want to be really careful, like you say about the transit or the roads or transportation options, and so that we're not also increasing the pressure on our ferry, for example, and all those things. And I like the idea of a site-specific DPs, because particularly in some of the smaller areas, I don't want to lose all the trees in Deep Bay, for example. I think those actually are too small. But anyway, and to be allowed, permitted now, is that right, Daniel? Would secondary suites be allowed in Deep Bay?
A secondary suite would, but not a detached.
Not a detached one, right, yeah. Anyway, I just don't want to, there could be a lot of changes, and I'm just going to, I don't have anything specific to say, except I appreciate the need to be careful. If these changes help us moderate the changes that could happen to be even more careful about keeping the island character, then that's good. And can I ask you to go back to that first slide? My question is, how much have people taken us up on this?
Not much.
Not much, right?
And we were scared, yeah.
And so, am I
Are we talking about the detached or the secondary?
detached?
Six.
Yeah, 6 so far. So I'm wondering why we should be even spending time on this, or would it, should we wait for another year?
Or maybe
Do
there's no
we need
take-up because the restrictions
Because of the
have been so
restrictions.
restrictive that.
But I also think there's been so few contractors and the big building boom, I don't know. Is that the reason why, or is it because you can't find a contractor? I've been watching the buildings trying to go up on Miller and people looking for people, so that's a kind of a
Can go.
question.
Yeah, you had your hand up there. What do you got?
Yeah, just to speak to that, Fritz, when he's looked at our building bylaws, he felt very strongly that one of the incentivizing factors was how many restrictions there were. And on the housing committee, I don't think we do feel that if we loosen those restrictions, we will have a sudden huge wave of people going out there and wanting to build. It's incremental still, but if we can make it a little easier for people to develop housing suites, it creates more rental and more capacity.
Well, I agree we need more rental, and so if I can just wrap up then, thank you. I'm not concerned about a speed or a big wave. It is the incremental that I'm concerned about is over time, will it meet the other things in our official community plan about maintaining our island character, nature, the sense of place, and in our era of climate change, will there be enough water and sewer, those kinds of things. So, thank you. That's my take on it.
Okay, I'll be quite brief. I support this for all the reasons Robyn gave in her overarching comments, but the only concern, it's already been mentioned, was, and when it was done at the time, I was worried that we're a place that's very hard to serve with transit because we're so dispersed, and that it would encourage more of that. So the idea, and I don't know how to do this, but I turn this back to Daniel to find some way of encouraging. I mean, already this is sort of allowing it in smaller lots rather than just great big ones off somewhere. But if there's some way of putting in there some criteria that closer to transit routes, or, you know, even if it's closer to the main road in the south where there isn't transit, but there could become transit because you're clustering. So something that would help us with our transportation problem, and I don't know how to do it exactly. I'll hand it back to
No,
Dan.
got everybody in the cove if you want to fix that problem.
Well, yeah, I agree.
Maureen?
I'll pass one.
Okay, Allison?
Rob, did you hear your hand up?
No, but I'll make a comment after.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure that this is ready to go, but and not get shoved into the housing bylaw. I don't have a problem with removing the 40% or the square footage area. I've always thought that was a bit silly. We've got lot coverage bylaws.
Yes.
So your footprint can only be so big and your height can only be so big. And there's a maximum square footage as well for lot coverage. You can't just keep building buildings. So if somebody wants to build the maximum lot coverage, and out of that they're going to create a secondary suite within their house, that if we didn't allow it, they would just build a smaller house. I'm thinking there's lots of people right now where I know that where the families, the kids have gotten married, and they can't afford to buy a house, they can't find anything to rent, they want to have their own space. And they're living in their parents' houses, and they need to be able to renovate those houses to create a totally separate secondary suite for them. And some of those houses already exist, and so what if they're not on the bus route? They're living in a house, they're not adding to any more site damage or tree removal or anything like that. The house is already there. And you've got somebody that's looking after the house, and in case one of the parents has a health issue, they're there to be helpful. So I don't have a problem, and I didn't have a problem with Deep Bay the whole time with, if you can build a garage, why can't you put a secondary suite on top of the garage? you know, it's not.
Garage doesn't use sewer and water.
Well, forget about the sewer and the water. The sewer and
Well,
water
can't forget
applies
about it.
everywhere and would be picked up in the building permit process.
Yeah.
So, and maybe we have to make, certainly for the sewer it would, the capacity and that kind of stuff, we need to think about it. I have a real problem with the DP process, doing it, because we're gonna have to design a whole bunch of guidelines, and then it becomes a bit subjective and, you know.
I also look at the workload and.
Yeah, well, workflow with the DP, I mean,
Permit process.
if you could make it simpler and.
Yeah.
And don't let a DP replace a building permit, I guess is partly what I'm concerned about. And the bit about sprawl, by adding a secondary suite to a house that's already there, you're not encouraging sprawl, because the sprawl's already happened, the house is out there. No, I don't have this section. I'm trying to read my handwriting here, which you know is always a problem. Yeah, and you know, neighborhood character is a bit, needs to be defined by the neighborhood, and sometimes things change, and removing, so I'm not unhappy with removing the 40% of the square footage or the lot size, but there was something in the lot size. Okay, and the building code changes, because it wasn't clear in number 7, you're saying that the 90 square foot is based on the old building code.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's no limits in there.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, those 4 houses that were done as duplex, as strata units up in Case Hill were extremely popular. But they had to be stratas because they were 2 different families, but if you just think about it, you know, the family situation. So I'm not sure that I'm ready to say just let's go ahead and amend the land use by right away. I think there's some process questions, and you know, if we end up over exceeding our capacity, we've got another report coming in a future committee in the whole on capacity with sewer and we're
Yeah.
sewer and
Well,
water
it's
and all that
capacity
stuff.
that, there's also the housing, the other housing survey that's being done.
And then the housing
Get the results
survey
from that too.
may give us a bit more.
I don't think there's a lot of pressure right now, but I might be
But
totally.
if everybody's in agreement with removing the 40% in the 90 square meters, and Daniel's doing some housekeeping amendments to the land use bylaw, then maybe go that way.
I'd like to
I
see
just,
more.
I don't know if that's incentive. Does that incentivize people?
What do you mean,
Well, if you remove the 40% and let them, you know, make it bigger.
it just gives us some flexibility and it aligns with the new building code. So if, to me,
Well, I
it's
think
kind of a
gonna happen.
housekeeping.
It's gonna happen anyway.
Yeah, it's
so
kind of a
that's- yeah.
housekeeping issue in my mind that now there's no
Yeah.
reason to have it anymore
And-
because it was set by the building code
And
previously.
I've always argued that actually the size of the secondary suite, I think, is smaller than what you allow for a detached, for a bed and breakfast. And if you're having, you know, a young family, they might end up with a kid, then it gets really, that's very small. And if it's, you know, it's like our house where you've got 2 floors, it would be really hard to break the second floor up, the lower floor, in partly us and partly a suite. But it would be easy to cut the 2 levels as 2 separate things.
Technical issues. Rob, did you want to?
Yeah, just a couple quick
Well,
things.
they're not, because then you wouldn't do it, because it's hard to do.
So the 40/90, I don't have a huge issue with. The bed and breakfast, I think makes sense. I can see that being an issue for you owners. The lot size, I mean, one of my criticisms of the last one was that it was really focused on bigger lots out there, where we ironically want to do the opposite. We want to get people living in the cove. So it was sort of, was a mismatch there, and I'd be supportive of looking at that. I did question the timing of this. You know, like we got the short-term rental coming up. We got a lot of stuff happening right now. So how deep we want to go on this, and the uptake is not huge right now. So I'm wondering how much of an emergency. I think we could definitely knock some of the smaller ones off before we start looking at adding extra capacity on. My worry is the sprawl aspect of it. Somebody's out there with a 10-acre lot, and then they do a big house, and then they do another house, and then they do secondary suites in the big house. And yeah, now you are creating sprawl in areas where maybe we don't want to concentrate people, and where we are going to have water and service issues and transportation issues and whatnot. So I mean, my suggestion here would be maybe we can knock a couple of these off right now and not do the wholesale thing, and see how that goes and how that goes.
All right, thanks, Rob. Maureen? Yeah. Back in.
I'm just surprised with the reaction to this. I think the Housing Advisory Committee basically has been working on this from the time that the committee was established. So this reflects a significant amount of work with a lot of debate around it. And we know that we have a bylaw development process that takes a considerable amount of time. And while there are a number of housing-related things that are going on concurrently, I don't think that there is any harm in putting this formally on the work plan for staff to start thinking this through in more detail. I mean, they have heard the concerns that are expressed here. A lot of this is not stuff that we as a council are going to be able to come to a landing on. There's going to need to be community consultation and really thinking through, what the impacts are. We spent a long time to get to the point where we would have the detached secondary suites bylaw on the agenda. We've been talking about it from the time that the last council was put in place. It had been on the agenda for councils from 2008, at the point when detached and attached secondary suites were divided. Given the amount of time that it takes to get stuff through process, I would strongly recommend that at this point that we pass the recommendation as stated. Coming back to some of the more specific points regarding sprawl. Sprawl does not just have to do with houses. Sprawl has to do with people. Sprawl has to do with being able to get to and fro. Sprawl has to do with a redistribution of need for services. So the criticism of the bylaw as it stands as one that potentially increases sprawl, I think is a fair criticism. The point that Allison made regarding the homes that currently exist, where people want to essentially renovate to enable family, perhaps to enable other rental opportunities. This is something that I haven't considered before, but perhaps there needs to be an approach that differentiates between renovations for existing homes and for new builds. We've talked about new builds as being rental ready, as being ready for the introduction of alternative energy sources, as being ready for electric cars and so forth. Maybe there could be some thought given to that as potential, and maybe there could be some relaxation that has to do with, if you're renovating, this is what you need to face. If you're doing a new build, this is what you need to face. And I don't know at all how that fits in terms of the building code. But just in order to give our staff the direction to start working on the next stage of this, rather than shelving it, I would like to move the recommendation as is.
No, I'll second it. I agree with Maureen.
Okay, Allison.
Well, my only concern with some of the changes that we're going to be dealing with the short-term vacation rental amendments, which I don't think are in the land use bylaw package. And they're going to be dealing with some of these same things. And we haven't had the housing needs assessment, which might push us to maybe encouraging something rather than something else in, maybe it's more secondary suites and less detached or things like that. So I guess I don't want this to sort of be done as a standalone and then a whole bunch of amendments have to be made to it later when these other things come. So that's sort of why I was saying, the 40% extent, could be argued as a simple housekeeping amendment, which could fall into the existing land use bylaws to match with the building code. But the other stuff is more policy type
Policy changes, yeah.
Changes, and it's going to require lots of community consultation and everything else, and it makes more sense to me to sort of try and do it all in one package from a time perspective.
So,
I think this is really worth exploring. I thank the committee for the work that they've done.
absolutely.
I think we need housing diversity. I guess one of the things that is concerning me is that this is increasing density on the island when we have an official community plan that has a density cap in it. And some of the things we've talked about in terms, so we'd just be adding more, potentially adding more people to the island without the zoning and the thinking about it that goes through the official community plan. Anyway, my feeling is putting that idea together with the one about moving the density to the cove, is all of this kind of thinking would be easier for me if we had a density bank where we kind of thought about what density do we have, where do we want to put it, how can we think about the future rather than just more. And right now we have a density transfer function, but it's hard, really, nobody takes us up on it because it's difficult to make it work and the land values are different. And it doesn't have to be a density bank, something that helps me feel like we're following the official community plan without opening it up to all this growth in the hinterlands by doing the concentrating the things in the cove. So I'm not sure how I'm going to vote.
Okay. I think that recommendation is a little open-ended. Daniel, I'd like to hear from you about your thoughts on this. And should we open it up this far, or should we just gradually open it up? How do we gradually open it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've heard from council, I think is right in that some of the changes really don't have an impact. They're not adding, right? They wouldn't allow additional secondary suites. They're just tweaking how we regulate it. So the 40%, for example, right? It's like that doesn't allow more suites. It doesn't. It's sort of tweaking how it's going to be shaped within what you're already allowed to do versus ones that say now you can have more suites, right? It seems like a bigger change that needs a bigger amendment. So, part of what we're looking for is like council's comfort going forward. They want to say, well, let's start a process and let's talk to the community about it and see what's appropriate versus saying, well, let's just do the easy and quick stuff. That maybe we would just build into another bylaw and say, okay, and we're doing housekeeping stuff and we're going to remove a couple of the regulations that don't make sense anymore.
Could you bring that part of it forward so we could get that out of the way? At another time, obviously.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think how then that council recommendation would go, right? I know what you're looking to do. I mean, in terms of Rob's question about is this emergent? What I see as emergent is the situations where we are making people take out secondary suites.
That's not good.
And so those are the bed and breakfast regulations. Those are sometimes the maximum size, sometimes the 40%. So it's when people come then to renovate and we say, oh, your second, this was built before the bylaw was in place, it doesn't conform, you need to you need to change it or you need to take it out, people take out the secondary suite.
So that sounds very sensible, that we allow the secondary suites with the bed and breakfast. I don't see that that's an issue. People are going to be in a situation where they can do that, and they have the facilities to do it.
Could we go back to the list of 7 and just see where there is agreement
that's
and where there isn't? Because I'm hearing a lot more agreement than.
Most of them.
Okay, so that's current.
That's the current one, it's the current list of something,
Okay, so where's the list that has the changes?
That is the list of 7.
Yeah.
So those are our current regulations, and then I could go through each slide that has the proposed changes, what the
Okay, so
committee's
you haven't
proposed
got all the
No.
proposed changes on one slide?
No.
Let's go through them. Because I
Yeah.
generally,
You're gonna have
we
your
are agreeing
Yeah,
and
all right.
disagreeing.
So at point one, the recommendation would be to amend this to allow some form of allowing additional suites on a property, so be it allowing one attached and one detached, or two attached properties.
That's one I've got a problem with.
Yeah, so that's the one that we're sort of.
But that's the one that we've also, as a council, if I'm remembering correctly, already approved for a home in the marina.
Yeah, the marina, yeah, we've got.
I mean, you've zoning way through,
Right.
given readings too.
But that was an existing piece of property in a sort of more of a
Commercial zone.
area, and so I guess it gets back to the comments that some people were making, of renovating existing versus new.
It's also around the site itself.
Yeah, the
The
site.
neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's not a slam dunk one, right? We can, I think we can all
Yeah, it's a
agree
no.
that there's a big issue there. So,
So number two is parking requirements, so look at having some sort of parking flexibility within the regulations. Right now it requires one per secondary suite.
Thumbs up.
yeah, I'm good with that.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Me too.
So what impact is the parking, how does that any different from somebody who's just building a house? Well, the land use bylaw right now, in part 5, how many parking spaces do you have to provide for your house?
It's one or two depending on the zone.
1 or 2, depending on the zone. So this is saying allow 50% compact size. So why wouldn't a person who's building a house be allowed to have a compact size rather than a full size?
I think there's some requirement of a percentage, because the compact
Yeah.
size is meant really more for commercial. So there's a standard
Yeah.
parking size,
Yeah.
and if you're doing a commercial lot, you can do like 30 or 40%. So
Yeah.
if you only have 2 spaces, one for the house, one for the suite, you technically can't do a small size parking space. Again, it's just I think, in my
Well,
opinion, it's
then I
just a bit
don't
of a
understand
housekeeping
what you're
flexibility thing.
suggesting with that then.
So it means if you have a small lot, and one of the reasons that you're limited to your suite is you have to provide a parking space for that suite, and you can only squeeze in a really small spot, or whatever it is, this would allow you to, again, it's just kind of there's an arbitrary percentage that if you just said, hey, yeah, you could do one compact, one regular, it just frees it up a little bit, you know? I think with very little impact.
But would that be allowing anything different for somebody who's building a house who has to have 2 regular? Why wouldn't they be allowed 1 regular and 1 compact?
Well, we're not talking about.
Well, I'm talking about
Building
fairness between house
Right.
builders.
So you're saying like I think the rural lots require 2 per dwelling, and then we say you need another one for a suite, you'd say why not, if they have 2, could one of those be a compact spot?
And maybe that's, you change the parking
Yeah.
bylaw so
Yeah.
that that's that.
It just it becomes so subjective, I mean, if you just look at A, B, C, and D, I mean, consider the neighborhood parking needs and capacity, what does that mean?
And that
Well, I
entirely
think
depends
people
on-
were mentioning like Deep Bay.
Yeah.
It's like parking there is so hard that if you
Yeah.
had somebody say, hey, I want to build a attached secondary suite, and like, but by the way, I can't fit parking on my site because it's too tight, or, oh yeah, we'll just use street parking, like,
Well,
that's kind of a
yeah.
no-go in my opinion, like, the parking there is crazy. So to be adding extra units and no extra parking capacity,
That's part of the impact on the neighborhood, really, too.
yeah, absolutely.
You have to be careful.
So I think that one needs to be thought about.
well, I don't know.
I'm actually fine with it as is, so I think there's probably more.
I'm good with it too, and I see the restrictions
You
to
mean
some of the places
Good with the
in the code
recommendation,
right
sorry,
now.
good with the recommendation as is, or good with the current?
No, with the recommendation.
With
That
the
it's more
recommendation.
flexibility,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. In part because, I mean, with pretty well everything that's come before us, and for much of the last term, we looked at parking reductions.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm okay with this.
Yeah, I'm okay.
I
I mean,
don't
I-
have a problem with it, the part I have a problem with is the control through the DP approval process. I'm just looking at the workload and, but you know what? There's only 6 of them in the last.
And it's just a
Yeah.
suggestion
5
on our
years.
part, like if staff
Yeah.
determines that, oh no, we don't need a DP for this, it's fine, or they can identify the neighborhoods where it's fine and it isn't. Like, again, these are just kind of suggestions on our part, recommendations, it's not like a hard fast, this is how it
Daniel,
has to
what would be an alternative to a DP process if somebody wants to put a suite in there?
Yeah, so if it's about not requiring parking
It's
for the
just part of the
suite,
building permit process.
then it would be like, these is just land use bylaw to say, well, you don't need a space, or, doing the compact car size is an easy one, land use bylaw change. Like if it's something we can build into the bylaw, then it's not discretionary, it's not development permit process, but it's just building permit. I think it's harder to do that, like, because the DP is to give you the discretionary approval to say, okay, sometimes yes and sometimes no.
That's fine.
That is the problem, so you're the guy.
Or the
Conceivably
guidelines are.
planning,
Or
yeah.
it is
Yeah.
And it also gives the public a chance to comment, doesn't it?
Depending on how you say it.
On the DP, okay, because like for right now, if you do a building permit and you comply, your neighbors have no say in anything.
Exactly.
If you do a rezoning or a DP, your neighbors get notice,
Depends
and they
on-
can say, yeah, and they can have feedback. right,
Depending on
in
what the
process.
DP is.
Yeah, fair enough.
So
Yeah. Or it's a-
is the DP for suites one that the neighbors get to comment on?
Not right now.
Not right now.
But I guess the point is that on this one, we're more leaning towards saying, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's number
I
3,
think part of affordability is not,
not having to own a
not
car.
having to own
and
a car, and we've just got, we've had some changes, right? We've adopted the transportation plan since this, Uber is now legal, we'll see what happens with that. But, we still have boat and lift and ride sharing and, various other options, so.
I also just on, not to dig this one into the ground, but people are changing, right? Like I got this stat, like 1985, something like 55% of 16-year-olds got driver's licenses. Now it dropped by 50%. So there is just the newer generation that's coming out this is not as big of a thing for them anymore. And I think if somebody's living in the Cove, right, to demand 2 parking spots, especially like some of these cottages and all that, it's never going to happen, but that's where we want people to live. So having that flexibility that people can do that there, I think it makes sense to me. So.
No, I think it makes sense, and that's the way we're going with all the parking and the transportation part of it, but, yeah, as long as it can be done without too much procedural input by staff, that's my concern. Anyway, that,
So 2 looks like potential.
that's, I don't
Yeah.
have a problem.
I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
I think the flexibility is a really good point, and we
Yeah.
need that.
Is it 3? Oh, 3 is the.
Oh, sorry, 3 is the B and B.
So, Raul, I'm good with that.
I'm good with that.
I
Okay.
think that would make a lot of people heave a sigh of relief,
Yeah.
given the current practice.
Yeah, and if it's impeding,
Well, a lot of this-
people putting it in, then we should include it.
A lot of this is legalizing.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
And
it is.
that's.
So what this is meaning is, I was a little confused by the wording, you can have a B&B and a secondary suite
Yes.
in your house?
Yes.
That's what's proposed, like right now you can't.
2 different operations,
Yeah.
but is this gonna help legalize the ones where we've got B&Bs operating in what is essentially a secondary suite?
I mean, that would be then the short-term rental.
Side of things,
Side of
it's
it, yeah.
regulated through that.
Yeah.
So this doesn't make that any easier for them able to apply for a B. I mean, I'm assuming there's some people out there that have applied for business licenses for B&Bs, but can't get them because they've got a kitchen.
We've made people take out
Mm-hmm.
kitchens or like decommission kitchens of bed, like to make what, could be a secondary suite, to make it a bed and breakfast to get a business license.
See, to me, this is updating, because now we've got business licenses, we've
Yeah.
got
But
short-term
it's not updating in
vacations.
that it's not dealing with that issue where they make people take their kitchens out.
We're dealing with that in the other work that we're doing.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm thinking this is one that belongs to be being done as part of the
Work,
STVR work, not this work.
Well, I think taking it out here just frees this up, and then you can deal with that as a separate issue if they're not layered. Do you know what I mean? That if this comes out, you can deal with it on its own through the.
Is that a recommendation for the
Vetted by the
STVR? Is this contrary to anything in the?
No, I think this probably matches.
Railroad policy?
Yeah, when I've talked to any of the bylaws, I think through the short-term rental, we would be looking to remove this regardless.
I thought I saw
Correct.
it in that.
Yeah.
3, 4.
Okay, so 3's okay, what's,
So 4 says no change, that's the maximum size of the detached secondary suite.
Okay, so 4, good.
5 is the minimum size of a detached secondary suite. So this is about considering either smaller lots.
Oh, I definitely agree with that.
Okay, I agree with this. That's 5.
Say that
Or,
So this would be considering detached secondary suites on smaller lots, so smaller than the 0.36 hectares.
there's a
See,
lot.
this is.
But we still have the lot coverage.
You'd still be lot coverage and you'd still have, like if number one, the first one was the one that said you could have more suites, essentially this wouldn't be saying more suites, this would just be saying, you know, potentially maybe it changes to whatever, a smaller size and says, okay, you can have a detached or an attached secondary suite, so it would be increasing the number of suites, you'd just be giving more options for the people.
And what's the difference between if you've got a 0.5 acre lot and you've got a house on it, but you can't build a detached secondary suite, but you can build a workshop that's huge.
Or you could
Well,
build an
I think
accessory
it's about-
residential building and operate it as a B&B, right?
Yeah.
But you can't rent it as a detached secondary suite,
Which makes.
which makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
See, these are the fine points I'm trying to,
Yeah.
because I haven't been following this as closely as you
Yeah.
guys have, obviously. And I, you know, one of my concerns is knowing the former chief forester for the city of Vancouver. He said when they brought in the laneway houses, they lost half their forest cover, half the tree cover.
Yeah,
Mind you, they could be, like you say, garages and things like that. I don't, anyway, my problem is that as long as it's controlled by the DP, because I don't want, well, I'm just concerned with people just turning them into.
so subjective, the end of that last part of the DP
Yeah.
process,
Yeah,
need to meet all the necessary criteria.
Well, the privacy and access and overshadowing is already there, for the privacy and overshadowing. Access to
Water and
services,
sewer.
transit. I don't, if the house, you know,
Why can't this just be part of the building permit process?
So the reason why there was a DP when we first did detached secondary suites was about concerns about impact on neighbors. And so the way to do that, or views, like the way to do that is through a development permit, anything that's like discretionary that says, yeah.
but the sewer and the water,
Yeah, so more like a building permit issue than a development permit issue.
I mean, what I like about this is it's gonna hopefully have more of this closer to the cove where there are smaller lot sizes versus the last policy, which is the opposite, right? Which is only people, only bigger properties can.
Forcing it out.
Yeah, forcing it out. I mean, it would potentially open up more development because it would make more lots able to do that.
denser, yeah.
Yeah, so that's,
I think one of the significant constraints on it going Wild West, which is the phrase that's being used, is simply the cost. It's really expensive to do
It
this,
is.
and that will be an inhibiting factor for many people. And we're
Just to be
seeing
clear,
that reflected.
I never used the word Wild West.
I did.
Thank you. Okay, I just, yeah, and I agree with you, and the only 6 new buildings probably reflects that, although it also probably reflects availability of contractors and things like that, but I'm just concerned about the long term, and some of our lots are pretty small
Well,
already, living on a tiny one.
then they wouldn't be allowed.
And lot coverage
Then they wouldn't
issues
be
gonna
allowed
kick in.
a lot coverage deal.
I mean, if they can build a building,
but a good example
Why
that
should we
somebody
live in
just
Brighton?
brought up is the laneway houses in Vancouver. I mean, they're done on, I don't know if the 25-foot lots have them, but the 33-foot
lots.
do have them. And a lot of them, I mean, it provides very great housing in a very, yes, sometimes disturbs a bit of vegetation, but a lot less so than,
Well, you know,
doing it
maybe
out in the
our
middle of
DP
nowhere.
could require vegetation screening or replanting of some trees or something like that, I don't know. We're taking a long time on this one topic.
Well, it was gonna be a long,
yeah.
long one anyway.
Anyway, I'm just not sure about, I have to think more about that.
Well, but the bottom line was, we all said, yeah, eliminating the minimum lot size. Is that accurate?
It's,
I mean, given the fine tuning that needs to happen, yes, but are we in agreement with the basic
I'm okay
change?
with looking at it, yeah.
and
Yeah, this is a direction
Yeah, I
for staff
don't-
to
I-
build, in my
Yeah.
perspective, a building's a building. So if you can build a garage or a workshop, then why can't it be a secondary suite? it's still gonna cause.
Well, workshop can be built in the,
But if you're gonna take down trees to build a workshop,
Side
you're gonna
setback.
take down trees to build a garage and all that stuff, and so what's the difference? And you've got lot coverage,
And
Water.
presumably
Water
easier
and sewer.
service.
and it's all, the servicing is already there, the
I think
roads are
that
already.
my
well, the
point,
servicing, you gotta be
it's
careful
not-
with the servicing, you know, you just,
But no,
if you've got a house and it's got 4 people in it, and you put another house and it's got 4 people in it, now you have 2 houses with 4
now
people.
you have one house with 8 people in it.
Well, potentially, I guess you could have, yeah, but it's probably not gonna happen.
Well, that's what's happening right now where the families are moving in with the family.
Can I ask what's point 6?
So what about 5?
Well, that's
I
the
think
one we
everybody's
all
okay with
agree
5.
not all.
Some
I got five.
reservations, yeah. So mostly yes.
Mostly yes.
6 is the one about matching up the
Oh, right.
building codes.
Those are the-
So-
Yeah, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I'm okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay.
I don't have 6 and 7. They're both the changes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so,
So can I just confirm what I've got written down is, 1 is iffy, 2 is mostly yes, 3 is yes, 4 is as is, 5 is mostly yes, 6 is yes, 7 is yes.
that's what I
That's
got.
what I've got.
Yeah.
So really 1 was the,
Yeah.
I mean, we could change, we've already had the recommendation moved and seconded, but we
Yeah.
could adjust it to include the amendments to secondary suite regulations, accepting the first, I don't know, how would we do that?
1, 6, and 7.
Well, if we wanted to change this one, removing number 1 out
Basically,
of that list,
Yeah.
what would that read like, do you think?
You could just say,
I thought 1 was a yes.
1 was okay.
No, it wasn't.
No,
No,
one
one
was
was
the
the
one.
third.
one
That's
was
where
the
they were
one
gonna
that-
allow
you
2
could just
instead of
number
one.
them,
Yeah, one's
An
controversial.
additional.
2 through 7,
Yeah, 2 through,
as
including
presented,
2.
as presented.
Uh,
Do you want to move that?
Yeah,
Uh,
well, it was already moved and seconded,
Yeah,
but
so,
the
okay.
accept a friendly to, regarding points, or
What are we
points.
calling them? What are they, sections, are they?
Clauses?
Or
Clauses,
recommendations?
These are recommendations from the housing
For
committee.
amendments to section 3.4.2, .3.4, .5, and .6, and
Sorry,
.7.
you lost me.
3.4 is the main section of the app, of the land use bylaw, and then it's subsection 3.4.2, 3.4.3, 3.4,
Again,
5.4.
lost me.
Yeah.
I think we should refer to
Refer
them
to-
as they're
Yes.
presented in the staff report, so when we go back, we
Okay,
know
no,
exactly what
that's
they are.
3.54.2.
Could we just say as discussed?
I think it's just provisions 2
2
through
to
7
7
as
as
discussed.
Yeah.
And I've made really good notes
I
of
was
what your
seeing those
concerns
numbers.
were.
That's good.
Because, I mean, the first point was iffy. Some of us were okay with it, and some of us were not okay with
Yeah,
it. So I'd like staff to sort of explore it
yeah.
a little further.
Yeah, and number 5, what are we gonna do with that?
I think this is,
We said
if I can
yes.
just say, I'm in support of this, I'm gonna vote yes for this, because all it's done is getting the ball
Yeah.
rolling with staff
Yeah,
and allowing more public process and more
Exactly.
time for us to think about it. And it's, I mean, we need to work at the committee, and so let's explore it further. With
Yeah,
one,
the-
with
yeah.
one gone, I can support the rest of it.
I don't think there's anything there that's gonna be really super critical in one way or the other, and it's got a long way to go.
Yeah.
Let's see what comes back, and then it's gonna have to go to the public after that, right?
Do we want to refer to the agency at this point?
Think about it, Russ.
Maybe when there's a bylaw?
Yeah, later on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Later.
sometimes
Let's
they're
staff-
interested in getting the
Yeah,
bylaw
let's
drafted
staff
is
move it.
useful.
maybe staff could put a bit more weight into it before we bring it to all once. Is what they're gonna comment on, they're gonna comment.
I don't think, I think the important thing is the direction we're going and not the speed we're going at. I don't see that it's really, really urgent,
I don't know.
but we must move it along. And I think it's part of our responsibility to do that, to react to, what we started. Okay, so, have you got any kind of well, we can't do a resolution anyway, but.
Yes, we can.
She's
She's got
the
it, there's a
committee will
motion,
recommend
been moved and
staff that,
seconded.
or recommend
Yeah.
council that.
as amended, right? What do you
So
want?
that council, that the committee of the whole directs staff to prepare amendments to the land use bylaw to include the amendments to secondary suite regulation as recommended by the Housing Advisory Committee, in brackets 2 through 7, as contained in the report of the Housing Advisory Committee dated January 8th and as discussed at the February 3rd CAL.
Okay,
So just one technical process question. Can we make direction to staff for bylaw amendments in the committee of the whole, or does the committee of the whole have to recommend a council, the council directs staff?
I think
Yeah,
that's what
the
council.
committee of the whole direct council.
Oh, sorry, yeah, the
Yeah,
committee
it's got
will
the-
recommend that council direct
Yeah.
staff, and we'll
Yes.
ratify them at the February 10th meeting.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Missing some words.
Okay, no more discussion. All in favor?
No.
Thank you, that is unanimous.
Thanks, Robyn.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
Yeah.
Good discussion.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Robyn. Sorry,
Can I
Maureen,
just
go ahead.
acknowledge the work that Robyn and
Yeah.
Allison and Fritz and Daniel have done on this. It has
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
tough going. We've had many conversations at the committee
Yeah.
table of this nature, trying to figure out what impacts these kinds of
I
recommendations.
don't know if we should tell them yet, but there's more to come.
There is-
This is one chunk, a digestible chunk.
Well,
but
there's
it's
more
more
in
on
Just
that
to warm us
report.
up. Great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to 2.2, which is the site alteration bylaws, strategic priority B1. Daniel?
All right, changing
Okay.
topics.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to talk about site alteration bylaw. So this was a priority in the island plan in 2019, and so for a site alteration bylaw in particular, it said review topographical mapping, review similar bylaws in other communities, present completed research and recommendations to council, and then draft bylaws. So I'm trying to do those first 3 steps here tonight. So what the report contains is a comparison between a development permit area for hazardous conditions with a site alteration bylaw, because there have been 2 different approaches that have been discussed in the past. So really the top line takeaway is that DP addresses impacts that stem from particular site characteristics. So it's looking at, this is steep, this is something that will, the site itself will create a hazard, and a site alteration bylaw addresses impacts that stem from particular activities. So it regulates, you can't excavate this amount of soil, you can't remove these amount of trees, or whatever that may be. These colors get weird, but essentially the steep slope development permit area or hazardous slopes comes from the Local Government Act, and it has certain designated powers that fall within it and what the intent of it is. So it's about largely protecting nature, but also reducing hazards to development. The site alteration bylaw comes out of powers in the community charter, and is about regulating. It says you can regulate, prohibit, impose requirements in relation to trees and or deposit, storage, or removal of soil or other materials. So about protection of the environment and the community, it says. And so the DP is triggered through locations. Your DP needs to have a map that says what kind of locations are triggered by needing a development permit, and a site alteration bylaw is triggered by what's the scale of the activity. So at a certain scale, you're going to trigger where you need a permit. And then the report contains examples from different neighboring communities. So I've just got a couple on the slide here for the development permit area, and then for the hazardous or the site alteration bylaw. Kind of just trying to show an overview of like, these are the types of things people regulate. These are what, each community has done their own work on saying these are exemptions, these are things we don't think need them versus these are things that do, and they all kind of, there's not like a one size fits all approach, but it's like what are we trying to regulate within our community? What's the intent behind the bylaw? And then you would develop the bylaw based on that. So then the site alteration bylaw. So there's, like Whistler's got different size, different permits depending on how much soil you're removing. They have different things that you're exempt from, and so on. And then when we try to show, do
Soil removal?
they define soil?
Well, is it like
Yeah.
digging out soil with a backhoe, or is it blasting and taking out rock?
I think they were both. Like if you're removing rock, you'd probably fall under soil removal. Like it's just like volume of
Stuff.
land material removed, I would imagine.
But we don't know for sure.
But that's not blasting the mountainside, that wouldn't be considered soil removal, would it?
I would think so if you're removing it.
Yeah.
Like if you
But
blasted
if you're
it.
not removing it, you're just blasting, leaving it.
Generally, they trigger like,
up the hill.
yeah, so where's our thing? Deposit, storage, removal of soil. I would imagine, and I have to look at how people actually do their definitions, but some of them probably capture it through, you're removing it from its present location. Even if you're just like moving it within the property, you're still removing it. You probably still fit that trigger depending on the scale. And this is trying to show that, so there's different different thing municipalities often regulate, and they use different approaches. So it, so North Van has a tree protection bylaw which protects trees, versus they have a slope hazard DPA, which is looking at both water supply and slope hazard and soil regulation. Whereas Port Moody has a tree protection bylaw and a site alteration bylaw, and then they have a bylaw about streams and drainage, and just that different communities have sort of looked at, okay, what is the intent that we're trying to achieve here, and looked at different regulatory mechanisms to get there. The island plan also talked about looking at the mapping data. So currently our OCP identifies steep slopes for a development permit area as a slope angle of 30% or greater for a minimum horizontal distance of 10 meters. So in the report you can see essentially a map that does that. So this is what it looks like. This is lot 2 that I just pulled, for example, to show where it would highlight as saying this is a steep slope by that definition. It's got a slope angle of 30% or greater for 10 meters. But one of the things we flagged through the research is you can end up, if this is the approach you want to go, steep slopes. So one, we're saying we have the mapping to go finer resolution than this, but that's what's the OCP, and so that's what the map right now is like. That's what the OCP says is the criteria. But to regulate steep slopes, something like a geotechnical assessment could be done that would have more detailed criteria for what requires a development permit. So it could look at some sort of combination of steepness, but also soil type. So it would say, well, if you're on a creek bed and it's this type of soil, and we've roughly mapped these across the island, this is your trigger, versus if you're on bedrock, well, maybe it can be steeper because we're not as concerned about what's going to fall.
Rockfall.
Yeah, or depth of disturbance. So I might say, well, if it's this type of soil, if you're digging in a foot, well, it's not going to matter. But if you're going down 10 feet now, it's suddenly now you've triggered your development permit. So there is, if that's sort of the direction we get from councils to look at this, there are, through that geotechnical assessment, you can end up with more refined exemptions from it. Yeah. So what the report looked for is essentially some conversation with council in terms of what's the intent behind this. I know this has been in the island plan for a while as some sort of mechanism for governing some sort of hazardous conditions and some sort of land alteration, but sort of just looking for that initial conversation with the council, saying, okay, how exactly, where do you want this to go? Because it seems like different communities do it differently based on what they're actually trying to, what they're worried about, what they're trying to regulate. So I grouped it here sort of in terms of are we concerned about risks? There's just kind of risks that you regulate, versus is it about ecosystem health, and or is it about land, just about any sort of land alteration? So it's not so much about the risk to the neighboring properties, but it's about that you're disturbing the soil and you're moving stuff around without permits. So that's where we're opening up for conversation.
Well, there's been a few examples over the last 2 weeks, in North Van a few years ago, about, mudslides and
Yep.
old cliffs.
Yeah.
So that, I guess, is a hazardous slope,
Yeah.
or is it a hazardous area? Because I don't know that all of them have necessarily been that slopey. But North Van went through a whole bunch because of that. But earthquake hazards, is that meaning somebody can't, how would we identify earthquake hazard or not?
David, go ahead.
Yeah, so Daniel, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking
Yeah.
us to do.
Yeah.
We could address these issues through hazardous area, DP of some sort, or we could do it through site alteration bylaw. And I can see the advantages of both. Some of the, with the DP, it's as long as we've got it done in sufficient detail, and we've got all kinds of data that we can now put in with LiDAR that will be available and so on. So some developer now can actually see, oh, okay, this is a tricky area, I have to take a certain approach. But the land use, the site alteration bylaw, could deal with some of the things that I'm concerned about near the bottom of the list, like the habitat degradation and conservation, that sort of stuff. But I can see the tricky part about the site alteration bylaw is somebody could have started altering things and messing things around before they even come to you. Whereas if there was a DP, if the DP's there, then people know what they have to do. Whereas if it's not there, and you're just relying on a site alteration bylaw, you do have some risks associated with that. Or do we need, what I guess I'm asking you, are you asking whether we should do one or the other, as some of these folks have done, or should we do both? Is that what you're?
I think what I'm really coming from is sort of get a better understanding, I guess, of what council is looking to
Control.
What are the things that we're most concerned about? So, this has been sort of a strategic priority for council.
Right.
But is it about, are we concerned about land alteration in general? Are we concerned about the potential hazards that are coming from it? Are we concerned about,
Okay,
like-
so I'll finish mine by
Yeah.
saying both. Both.
In terms of what's been in the island plan over the years, it has been hazardous slopes. That's what we talked about for a long time, and we ran into issues around the accuracy, the mapping and so forth. I think it was probably the last island plan, maybe the one before, where we started shifting discussion to site alteration. So both have been on the, on the horizon. And when I looked at this, I had the same reaction as David, which was, it really is both that we are and Cyril, you just commented, it really is both that we're interested in. But then I guess the question is there a priority, one over the other? I mean, they're dealt with, when you did the sort of compare and contrast of the approaches, and you characterized it as one has to do with the terrain, and the other has to do with the activities on that terrain. I mean, even though there are different legislative authority from the perspective of a municipality or somebody doing stuff with the land, both come into play. So one of my questions was, is there any precedent, is there any community where both are handled at the same time within a single bylaw? Or do they end up going to two bylaws, or do they prioritize one over the other? There's a lot of questions, sorry.
So,
Part of the answer is in that list.
Yeah,
I mean, Squamish has an array of both.
a suite of bylaws, yeah.
And I think they're both too in terms of like the hazardous development permit area is saying, okay, we want to regulate you making a hazard from it. Whereas there's things people can do that alter their own land that aren't creating a hazard.
Yeah.
So people are concerned about, well, I don't want somebody to cut down all the trees and then to, excavate a big amount without any sort of oversight. Well, maybe they're not creating a hazard because it's a flat site and they've just cut the trees that aren't near any waterfront and they're just digging a hole because they feel like, they wouldn't be captured by a municipal DP, they'd have to be captured by a site alteration bylaw, but maybe we're not worried about that as much. We're more worried about, well, you can do something that's gonna mess up the slope and impact your neighbors.
so why are we getting involved with regulating it when if somebody, let's just say there's a development proposal, somebody comes to do a development. This is, okay, I got this 10-acre piece of property, here's what I'd like to do. Say, okay, well, first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna get an environmental assessment on it to see if there's any environmentally sensitive areas on it and a whole bunch of other things, the environment and then also a hazardous, and get a geotech in there and look at hazardous slopes. And then it says, okay, well, this cliff over here, you gotta stay away from that or whatever. I mean, I don't know why we're trying to regulate it unless it's people coming in an unregulated fashion to deal with it, but they're still doing it anyway. So I don't know what the purpose of it is and what we're trying to achieve.
Sure. I mean, I guess I see some of the gaps in our current system,
Okay.
right? So one, I mean, at rezoning, council can require environmental assessments done, but there's nothing blocking somebody doing like alternate stuff before applying for rezoning. There are controls at subdivision stage, so the approving officer has authority to look for the geotechnical stuff and the environmentally sensitive areas, but again, there's nothing stopping people altering land, before the application is made. There are, the building inspector has authority to ask for the geotechnical stuff for the
Yeah.
building at building permit stage,
Yeah.
but not for just general land development. So in terms of if somebody's building the road in or something,
Yeah.
and they've built it and then they come apply for a building permit, well, we can require it for that building, but not necessarily, it can't look back and say, but the stuff you did 6 months ago that wasn't a building, it was just land alteration. We don't have authority to ask to require a geotech.
Are they gonna do that anyway? I guess that's my question. Or because it's a DP, then, you know, it needs a DP on that property. But they're not gonna know that because they haven't come to the municipality to search it out. So they're gonna go and do their land clearing anyway, and then we're gonna say, hey, you're not allowed to do this. They're gonna say, well, I didn't know.
But it's on the map, they should have known. Ignorance is no excuse.
Well, if it's on a map or if somebody looks at it, what's the difference? They should have permission before they do
But
that
you're
work on
saying
the
they'll just
property.
go ahead and do it because they didn't know, but they can't use that as a defense because it was on a map and part of a bylaw or a.
God, it just seems like babysitting to me, but anyway.
A couple of things I'd like to offer when I've got everybody's attention.
Just showing something. Fenton's.
Okay, thank you. I just, thanks for including Denman and Galliano on this list. Just something that might be unknown is that Denman and Galliano, as part of the Islands Trust, can't do bylaws, the kind of bylaws that we're talking about here, regulatory bylaws. They only have DPAs as a tool, and this is the heritage of Bowen Islands coming from. This is partly why we have so few, as I understand it, regulatory bylaws, is because we came from the Islands Trust. So some people say we have official community plan, but we don't have bylaws with teeth that can actually stop bad things from happening. And so I agree, I think we need both. We need a DPA to show things on the map. And then, Bonnie's in the room here. I think, Bonnie, we had a report on the kinds of bylaw complaints, and wasn't one of the higher ones the numbers of people who were concerned about damage to the environment in their neighborhoods?
Well, sometimes too, water flow changes, right? If somebody goes in and blasts and changes alteration, and also too, we don't know what effect blasting has on groundwater resources as well.
Right.
So those sort of complaints.
Yes. So here's my other reason, thank you, Bonnie, is back when we were doing the official community plan, that's where the two DPAs, the development permit areas that were recommended and that got to a certain stage through the OCP process, the one about steep slopes and the one about sensitive ecosystems, came out of that OCP process, which was rich with community consultation and built on community consultation from before. And in that process, I remember hearing, it was either then or around then, our public works manager at the time was talking about people who, when somebody put a driveway in, because they were remodeling the house up above, they changed the driveway, and suddenly when there was a big rainstorm like a couple of days ago, water was coming down and rocks were bouncing down through their basement windows, you know, so it was damaging the properties down below. So that's the kind of rain, and now here we are in climate change. I'm also concerned about climate change in terms of water, not just the runoff, which can be changed dramatically to affect the sites below, but infiltration. So in your report, Daniel, I see you've got a couple places where you talk about permeability of surfaces, which is great, and carbon sequestration. But the other part of that relates to the logging side of this, the wholesale clearing and blasting, which reduces the ability of the land to hold water. So that could affect water availability, groundwater availability as well. Anyway, I've got all kinds of concerns in invasive plants, and which has become a problem that we're starting to spend money on in the community too. And I'm concerned with conservation. Like, do we want to protect the ecosystems on our island that are rare and sensitive as an island in the Islands Trust, or just through our own official community plan? Anyway, that's my speech. I'm for both. I'm sorry to take up too much time, but I think there's important issues, and I'm in support of doing both. This is great.
So basically this motion, if we did do both, would just read like it reads with an addition of the site alteration bylaw in there. So I'm good with that, because I think we need to do both, and I think it makes sense to do them at the same time as well if we're going to do it, because it does seem like there's quite a bit of overlap with these issues. So.
I don't have a problem with that, with the recommendation as such. I mean, it's pretty general.
How would that work,
It's
Daniel?
very general.
So it'd be to direct staff to develop a work plan for a development permit bylaw to address development in hazardous areas that can potentially exacerbate risks to people and the environment, and a site alteration bylaw to address. I guess I'm just addressing.
Risks to people in the environment.
Really the same, but why don't we put,
Is it
why don't
soil
we put
disturbance?
both of them there, so
Before the
So,
exacerbate risk.
work plan for a development permit bylaw and a site alteration bylaw to address developments in hazardous areas that can potentially exacerbate risk to the people and the environment.
The only trouble there is the word hazardous.
Hazardous, but yeah, do we need that in there?
Yes,
Well, that's essential, I think.
Yeah, so
Because-
hazardous and,
Development, including in hazardous areas?
no. You're, here's my file, going back to 2005, so long before the OCP update. And it started off with steep slopes. And most people's objections were, I mean, here's the map. The one you got up on
That was a
the
very
screen
bad map.
doesn't, but if this is the same map that you had up on
Yeah.
the screen, and there's absolutely nothing hazardous about my piece of property. And it's on the hazardous slope, and it's on the steep slopes map, but there's absolutely nothing hazardous about,
But that,
It's
I mean, kind of
it's not even
talks
steep.
about that in the report,
Yeah.
is that you need to have more detail, and that's,
Yeah,
and you
but
said,
it's not that
whether
it's
a rock
steep.
or it's a.
Yeah, steep
It's all-
doesn't make it hazardous.
That's correct.
So could I suggest,
Hazardous is a very key word.
could I suggest that the recommendation be that the committee of the whole directs staff to develop a work plan for bylaws, plural, to address development in hazardous areas and to address site alteration that can potentially, yada, yada. Does that work?
Exacerbate risks to people in the environment, you're
Yeah.
right? Yes, I second that.
Got it.
And so one of the things, we've already got the streamside water protection area
Yeah.
bylaws, which deals with a lot of
Yeah.
water things, so, you know, and I didn't bring the other ESA projects in here too, which is equally as thick. So I've got a problem with using, I think the ESA should be different from the development in hazardous slopes areas. They're two
Yeah.
different things in my mind.
Yeah.
ESA?
Environmentally
sensitive
areas.
Yeah.
No, no, it's,
I guess, Allison, when I'm saying this, the risks to people and the environment, I just view that as that's falling under the hazardous slopes. That's like a landslide may not hurt people, but would hurt whatever's below the landslide. More
Yeah,
than about
okay.
environment, like, yes, I agree, development to
All right,
sensitive
so we're
area
not
would be a
getting
separate,
into-
yes.
A tree cutting bylaw that you can't cut a tree on your property that's bigger than X and stuff like that.
Gosh, I hope not.
No, I agree. Yeah,
we're talking about potentially exacerbate risks to people in the environment.
yeah, which I agree with all of that. I just don't want to get in too deep into tree cutting and stuff like that. But then somebody says, well, how do you stop somebody from coming and clear cutting their lot?
Well, if they're gonna have a farm, they can.
I guess so, yeah.
Okay, so the soil removal bylaw, I mean, it gets back to the
I don't have any
question.
soil.
Most of this island is rock, there's not a lot of it is soil, though there's an issue, an area where the dirt and mudslide, we've had a couple of areas where it's more dirt than it is rock. So if people wanna stop somebody blasting away a rock to level the land, does that get caught by this kind of thing?
I think sort of the motions of site alteration. And I have
Because-
to imagine, like, I'd have to look more closely into the
Okay.
definition,
So
but
it's not a
in my
soil
head, it would
removal
be,
as much as a site alteration?
yeah.
My pet peeve is what happened up here.
Yeah.
That was absolutely disgusting.
What are you talking
The area on the way.
Or
where-
All the area on the way up to the thing up there, where the Wolfgang cleared up there.
I think the blasting, the noise of the blasting that
It
was.
went on for a year and a half.
And I remember over on, above, I guess where Ted Bentley,
Yeah.
anyway, over that way, there was,
That was a hazard.
years of grinding them.
Oh, yeah.
Both the blasting and the equipment, going back and forth. Anyway,
There is, you know, obviously we're building on bedrock, there has to be some reallocation of the bedrock.
But
Not like what
So the
happened up
site
here, there's not a
alteration-
tree in the place, and it just,
Yeah.
I
So the
don't
site
know,
alteration-
could that be avoided?
I mean, that would depend on, you know, what it would capture and what the exemptions are.
Well, that's, why are we doing this, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, if that's the goal, that's what I hear from council, it's like, you know, it's helpful sometimes to have an example of being like, this is what triggers it for us, this is why we're worried about this. It's examples like this or like that, and then we can say, okay, you know, what's the scale of that, what made that rise to the level? This isn't like somebody cutting 2 trees in their backyard, but
No,
this is, right?
Exactly,
This is-
it's exactly right.
But that's my
It's
question.
the magnitude of
But is it the
devastation.
magnitude of removing the rock, or is it the issue of the noise that it took to do it?
Well, they didn't remove
And if
it.
it's noise, then that has to be dealt with under the noise bylaw. Not saying you can't remove it because it's noisy.
I'm sensitive of the time here.
Yeah.
I think we should
May we
vote on
follow
this.
recommendations of
Okay, so we've got, does anybody want a reclarification of
Can
what's
you read it
written here?
again?
Read it again.
Sorry,
Yeah,
it took
it's
a
not
while.
been moved or seconded yet. That
Oh,
the
yeah.
committee of the whole.
Wait,
I moved,
I seconded.
Okay,
Yeah.
any further
I
discussion?
wanted to hear what it said.
Okay, Hope, sorry, go.
That the committee of the whole recommend that council direct staff to develop a work plan for bylaws to address development in hazardous areas and site alteration that can potentially exacerbate risk to people and the environment.
Very simple.
could you
Yeah.
put an
Agree.
in front of site alteration, so it's clearer that it's 2 separate bylaws?
Oh, yes, yeah. good
And can
catch.
you put in the bit about committee of the whole direct council to, or recommend that council?
She did that.
You did
Yeah.
do that?
Yeah,
Okay,
she
sorry.
Yeah.
I was listening for the other parts.
That's further discussion, all in favor?
Yeah.
That's
Okay,
unanimous,
thanks.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel.
Okay, we're gonna move on to 3.3,
Words here.
proposed land use bylaw housekeeping. It's Daniel Martin,
Okay.
only one more.
So this one is quite lengthy, as you see from the report. So
Yeah, you can see
I
executive
just want to say,
summary.
staff have been working with the Advisory Planning Commission since I think sometime in 2018, and focusing on the definition section of the land use bylaw, and then somewhat on section 3, so the general regulation. So the goal has been to address problematic or unclear definitions, to remove or consolidate unnecessary definitions and regulations, but not to change site-specific zoning. So I've all been trying to almost scale back the APC at times to say we're not interested in looking at, you know, the zoning of this area, but we're saying what are like general definitions. And so I'm conscious of the time and thinking like I can start to go through this, but know that this is like an ongoing piece. And so I don't know how much council want to get into each of the slides that I go through, or want to just have a high level initial conversation and know that it's something that.
Well, if there's amendments in here we don't agree to, then we
Yeah.
don't want
Yeah.
to pass the omnibus motion that we're.
Okay, what's everybody saying for our finish time here? Do you want to be out here by quarter to 6 or 6:30?
What is it?
10 to 6, I told Heather I'd be home around 6, which is, means I have to have left 5 minutes ago, but 6:15 will be okay.
Okay, let's plan for 6:15. Is everybody okay with that? Okay, that's a 2-hour chunk here, so. And what do you think, Daniel, you can do here in 10 minutes?
Sure. And so what I'll tell you too is at the start or sort of the
Give us a contentious part.
yeah.
Yeah, give us the
Yeah.
stuff that's gonna rattle our feathers.
So how I see it are the what I'm calling sort of the building definitions. These are the ones that go into like when you build a house. These are like the foundational things that we use to determine, okay, how much can you build? So one of those is how we measure grade. So essentially, if you think about height of a building, we have to measure from where does the building start, and then you measure out to where does it stop. And so we define with these 2 things that are the average finished grade and the natural grade. So that's saying what's the grade of the house when it's going to be when you're done, and what was the land when you started. And then we look for a site plan that shows each of the corners of the house. So, and we say what are the grade at each of those corners of the finished and the average, and we then divide it by essentially the number of corners of the house to get that grade level. So what I put together here is just showing some of the issues that we have with it. Is that in essence right now, if it's a square, we would look like this, and we would take the elevation of each of the points, and I've just sort of made an arbitrary thing here to say this building would have a grade of 7.5. So we say that's the starting point. We'd measure up the height, and you're 9 meters above 7.5, and that's the top of the house. What you can do based on our definition, is you can add, essentially, if you add complexity on the top hill side of the building, you can alter your grade quite simply. So this would make it, by adding these points up here, so they've now made this building have a grade of 15 instead of 7.5.
Yeah, so that's crazy.
Yeah, so it works really well if you're, if you assume everything's a square.
But why can't you just go to the A, B, C, D on the other one? Just go to the corners again and take that?
Yeah, so some,
Because it's a definition we have
the
in.
definition is anywhere that two walls meet, and meet the ground, right? So it's saying, as you add points,
Okay.
you add complexity.
How do you fix it?
I'm gonna have that slide here. Just go. So what we looked at a couple different places. So some places end up trying to essentially define like what are the outer exterior points of the building, and they would say, okay, even in this, we're going to define that these are the outer points.
Yes.
Which is nice, but are some more confusing at times because then essentially staff are trying to say these are your points.
This is your outer
It
ones.
depends on
No.
who's looking at it. So instead, what I recommended is something that West Van does, where they essentially they consider the length of each of the line segments, and that gets built into the ratio. So you'd say, well, this CB line segment, has these points and is this long and is this ratio of the exterior. So it's a little more complicated to calculate, but essentially then you'd end up with, both of these examples would end up with roughly the same grade, or end up with the same grade.
So the percentage is the importance of that.
Yeah, so they'd say these line segments are higher, but they're a little overall percent, whereas this AB is lower and it's so much larger.
So if
That
you
makes
did
sense.
it,
Nowadays, everybody's got a calculator.
Yeah.
if you did it in this particular what would it come out to? That's 7.5, what would that come out to? It'd be a little bit higher, obviously.
I think, no, in theory it would be the same, because
Oh,
let's say
okay.
these
Okay.
are, maybe a
Small
little bit,
segment.
because there's more of a segment up here. It doesn't work quite clear to me this up, so I don't have blanks for this, but,
I think that's a grand idea. I'll buy you a calculator.
all right.
Let's do it.
All right, so great, so the next one would be floor area, so this is then, and this comes up, so not many of our zones have a floor area maximum, like Kate's Hill does, Village Commercial does, but lots of our places just use lot coverage. But where this has come up more often is detached secondary suites, and then secondary suites, both of which have the floor area maximum. And so right now what we do is we measure to the exterior walls and we minus 15 centimeters from each side. And that's essentially trying to be the midpoint of each of the walls. And we then say anywhere that's less than 2 meters apart is not counted in floor area. So what we've seen with the 2 meters apart is by building code that's 6'6.5", and you can put in like a crawl space that's 6'6".
So it would count in your floor
So it
area.
would not count. If you're 1.99 meters high, you're 6'6". It currently does not count in your floor area. So people building detached secondary suites quite commonly have large storage areas that are.
Sorry, 2 meters. 2 meters is what, 7?
Yeah, 6'6.5" I think it is.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So you can be just under that and you don't count floor area.
Yeah.
So what we would recommend is two changes. So one, so dropping this crawl space area to 1.5 meters to say, okay, it's actually a crawl space, it's not a usable space. But then also change the floor area to measure to the inner surface of the walls. So this is saying, through step code and other changes, we're looking for, increased wall depth. So we shouldn't be penalizing people from that. Let's measure the inside, and people can build as much insulation as they want, and they're not penalized in their floor area for that change.
Is that an either
Makes a
or
lot
you're
of sense.
suggesting, or both?
So both changes, I think. So both to the measure to the inner and to drop the.
That's far
That sounds
simpler.
good to me.
Far simpler.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
So why did they use
Yep.
2 meters in the first place?
I don't know. It's significantly higher than anywhere else that has a
Let's keep going.
floor area
So
change.
does the building code have a definition of the story?
The building code has definitions of like minimum heights for rooms based on its use, and it's sort of like a minimum threshold of what the room has to be a minimum height.
So there's nothing that requires a minimum height of anything less than 8 feet?
So you can build like a storage area that's 6'6" in like in your basement, it could be 6'6".
So you're saying take it to 1.5?
Take it to 1.5 to say this is not a floor
Which is
area.
5
It's
feet.
like now it's
It's
not
pretty
like
useless.
It's a huge
It's storage.
loophole.
Yeah,
Short people.
that's what it
Short
is.
Yeah.
Play area for little kids?
Yeah. So the next one is the lot coverage. So this again comes up quite often because lots of places don't have floor area. We choose lot coverage. And so currently our definition says the percentage of the lot area covered by the horizontal footprint of all buildings and structures. So horizontal footprint, so we can try to figure out what that means. And so how we've interpreted it is footprint is where like the building's touching the ground. It has footprint, right? It's touching. But this means things like projections. Well, decks, if they're supported on posts, would say, well, they're included. If they are, balconies that extend outwards, well, that's not in lot coverage because it's not part of the footprint of the ground. And so now we're saying the total horizontal area. Yeah. So saying, okay, it's over, so in practical matters, we say something's less than 2 feet high, it's not
2
counting
feet,
lot
yeah.
coverage, but we would include that in the definition. But we would say that the exterior area of the lot, or of the building, so the total, basically measure the outside wall. So if you have a projection that comes outwards, you measure to the outside of that, even if it doesn't touch down on the ground, but it's sort of a,
So if you've got 2 walls
yeah,
and a big cantilever deck in between that connects
yeah.
right across, then that's now going to be counted in floor area?
Yeah, so if you had your wall and you
0.6.
had a projecting box at the side of your building, so it would measure from the outside of that. So when you look down from the top, and you say this is the outside of your building, we'll measure from the outside of your building and not just where you supported your projecting feature.
Well, the projecting feature isn't supported, it's cantilever.
Yeah,
So it's now going to be included.
so it would now be included.
And excludes even up to
Even
maximum.
though it's a deck,
Yeah, so right now we include decks if they're,
but not if they're
posts,
cantilever.
but not if they're cantilever,
So now
yeah.
you're going to include a cantilever
Yeah,
deck.
yeah.
It's somewhere where you can't do anything else, you can't grow a tree.
Yeah, it's the footprint of the physical building that you.
People walking around on it with their footprints.
Anybody else have any issues with that? The eaves to a maximum of 0.9, what's that, 3 feet? 0.9?
About
4 feet.
It's about 3
3 feet.
Yeah, 3 feet.
He said more in the description.
I know, and I think this
Four
is one where I've
something
kept,
else.
sorry, this is one where I've kept the same APC presentation I gave, and the APC said 1.25
Yeah.
meters, and so I would
Yeah.
actually be changed that to 1.25, I think is what the report says.
So are you talking about 3 feet or 4 feet?
4 feet.
4 feet's good
4 feet makes it much more
in this climate.
So 0.9 is going up to 1.25
Yeah.
or whatever. it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because there's 2 different places where.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, this one.
All
All right,
So
so lot line, this is our current definition of the front lot line, so it's the shortest lot line common to a lot and a highway. Where there's more than one lot line common to the lot and the highway, the shortest of these lines is the front lot line. So, I go in here just to say, you know, this happens quite a lot on roads, so this
Yeah.
may be the main road, this is the undeveloped road right away, and we'd say this is the front. Or in this case, we'd say this is the front,
Yeah.
and this becomes the rear.
And where's the drive, I mean, it has no, even your new one doesn't consider the
No,
historical setting of the driveway
yeah,
or where their address is. And to me, that's the front lot line. Where your driveway comes in and where your street address is.
I could move my street address.
What-
But that's not the way it's defined right now.
No, well, we've had several problems come up because of it.
and so this is one, yeah, when I brought it to the APC like discussed for a while and had ideas around, either treat them all as front, like all of them should be front lot lines, so if you do this, we'll call this is your front and this is your front, and just call
So
it
you
all.
only have one side.
And so then you'd have, yeah. I know when I was in KidMat, we would say it's both front and then they're both, the other two are both sides, and you just don't have a rear at that point, and it becomes sides. So what I've got in the report right now is essentially what Salt Spring does, and says, removes the issue of like having these tiny little line segments, doesn't quite solve all the other issues, and so I don't think I've quite nestled there, but I'm flagging it as this is something else that we want to look at, and to work out because of these examples. And it's quite often when people actually design their whole house based on, well, this is my front, because this is where the road is, and then they come for their building permit, and we say, actually, this is your front lot line over here,
Yeah.
because this is your shortest one, and now you have to move here, and it's a whole thing.
So I think that's very sensible, what you're recommending. What historically, as far as the setbacks, what happens? Are they grandfathered to the original?
So if we change the definition so that somebody now, like they built it and that was the front, and now we're saying this line's your front,
Yeah.
they'd essentially be existing non-conforming. So as long as
Yes.
they can stay there, they can repair it and maintain it in its current siting,
Yeah.
but they can't extend further into the non-conformity, so they couldn't build anything else next to where they're now within the setback if we changed
But
it.
theoretically, they're gonna get some more land somewhere else.
Anyway,
Yeah.
So on this drawing here, what's their front lot line going to be in your new definition?
We're gonna probably end up being this one.
Which is absolutely stupid.
It's on the main road.
Well, it's part of the main road, but they probably,
come off of,
they're probably
There,
coming off up
yeah.
there, yeah.
That doesn't really matter where they're coming off of, you know, when you wanna do, because your front setback is so much further than your side setbacks, right? You'd rather have your side setback closer to the road, probably.
yeah.
I would. Anyway, that's,
I think this
Um,
is very tricky, given the variety of
Mhm,
lots.
yeah.
A variety of lot shapes, I mean, because people might want the long house, because, you know, there's a cliff there and the views there, and now they've got to have more, you know, setback, yeah.
that's gonna create a lot of, non-conforming, legal non-conforming lots.
Will it solve any of the problems we've got or had?
It solves, the shortest one is it solves the, ones that should build like on an arc, so it's the more recent subdivisions where the road comes all the way
Oh,
around
yeah,
the
yeah,
property, right? So it doesn't help as much with like the older subdivisions where they're this one, where they've got the short one that just happens to be not developed versus the side that is developed and where it ends up. But it solves like more of the recent subdivisions are more likely to have a road that follows all the way around the property and the road. And so you end up with all these tiny little segments and you're trying to look
Yeah.
at like, okay, well, this is the shortest little segment. And it's kind of strange. And it doesn't help this one too, which is, this lot just doesn't have a front lot line, which is what happens on Bowen.
Oh, yeah.
So.
That's a bullet, isn't it? Okay.
So the next one is how we measure height for things like fences and retaining walls. So right now it says you would take the lower of the average natural grade or the average finished grade to the highest point of the structure is what our definition says. But what we actually do for structures like fences and retaining walls is we measure the vertical distance at any point. So rather than taking the average, if you think about a retaining wall that's built on a slope, right? We wouldn't say, oh, we have to average the points and you end up with a grade that's somewhere in the middle. And at the bottom of the slope, your retaining wall can be 50 feet high, and at the top it can be 6 inches high. But to say, no, it's at the maximum height of each point of the wall. It has to be a maximum height.
Is there a definition of retaining wall somewhere?
So that's, again, in the report, I recommend adding that there's not right now a definition of retaining wall.
So you're gonna add a definition of
Yeah.
retaining wall and a seawall, and what about just a wall?
I think retaining wall, as distinct from
But
the
what if
fence.
somebody just builds a wall?
Well, then I would say it's a structure.
It's a fence.
It might be a fence.
Yeah, I mean, what is it?
Yeah. I mean, oh yeah, wall is a fence. There's just a couple,
Is that defined anywhere?
I think fence is defined in there.
The fence is defined, but the fence doesn't say it's a wall.
Do we talk about this now?
Well, no, we've got examples of people building 6 foot high concrete walls that are 2 feet wide with no dirt on either side.
Right.
That's a wall.
Okay, so you want to get rid of these?
high.
Yeah, so these are ones
Okay.
that we want to get rid of.
Let's get rid of these.
We got these?
So these are current definitions. The strange one is so agriculture uses across any rural lot, and it excludes vineyards. So we say specifically there's only one lot on Bowen that has a vineyard allowed. So technically nowhere else on Bowen can grow grapes or fruit or berries for production of wine. So
Take it out.
we would say we would remove that. That definition, same with amusement arcade, which only exists to be excluded from other definitions.
It seemed very moral.
Yeah. This was a recommendation from the design panel that came to council and council directed us to look at. So just expanding the sign definition, so it's not about a structure, but it's about signs could be on things or, yeah, they're not just a separate structure. No. So then we have this in definition that I also talk about could potentially, we have definitions for guest houses as well, and looking how those can actually, maybe we could collapse them into one. But currently our in definition doesn't actually define anything, it's a building or a group of buildings, and then it may contain different things and may have different things, but it's not actually,
Doesn't talk about the
it's
use,
not actually anything in particular.
not based on permitted use.
Yeah. We have a number of definitions for dwelling. So let's do, we have apartment dwellings, we have just dwelling unit, we have attached, detached, two-family, townhouse dwelling. And so primarily we look at combining. So attached just means if you have more than one dwelling unit, it's an attached dwelling unit. We then go apartment dwelling, which is 3 or more and access to a central area. And townhouse dwelling is about essentially defining row housing, so it's saying it's like vertically separated lines like this along. And so we suggest potentially they can be combined, so anywhere we allow apartment dwelling, you know, if we just allow attached dwelling, it would have the exact same purpose, it wouldn't change anything. And I think the apartment dwelling and townhouse dwelling are only allowed in lot 2 of the community lands, I think that's there. So it's not, so like the village commercial zones allow attached dwelling, and that would permit them to build apartment buildings or build townhouses.
If you come up some of those categories, does it create any problems for alignment with census data and stats data?
I wouldn't think so, in part because, as I said, that apartment and townhouse are really just lot 2 zones. So we actually don't have anything built as an apartment dwelling or a townhouse dwelling, we just have an attached dwelling. So the townhouses down that are attached dwellings, they're not.
So the buildings up above the general store aren't apartments?
They're attached dwellings. Like, in the village commercial zone, we only allow attached dwellings, we don't allow.
No, the general store.
Yeah,
Well, I
So the
thought
village
that was
commercial.
zone was considered an apartment for assessment.
so it could be, but I think that would be different than our zone, which just says it's attached.
All right.
So again, for supportive housing, we have these definitions for personal care home and supportive housing. That APC did talk about at length that they're slightly different. They're looking for different terms of care. But again, they're uses where I think we only allow each of them in a couple zones that are specific, and maybe we need a more blanket definition that would capture both and say, well, we allow personal care home, maybe we're allowing supportive housing as well. Is there a reason why we're separating them? So next one, so this is now moving out of definitions and into the general regulations. So right at the start of this, we have some things that are prohibitions across anywhere on Bowen Island. So one is airports, hovercraft ports, heliports. So this is actually a federal jurisdiction item, so we actually don't have authority to
put it in.
So we're not allowed to prohibit airports on Bowen Island.
So if somebody
We have a heliport.
wants to land a heli,
With a
or anywhere,
I mean, they have to meet like federal regulations.
you know, because it's federal regulations, we can't. put it
Yeah,
in.
but it trumps us.
So if somebody applied to put in a heliport,
They'd have to do
they
it through the
applied with
feds.
feds and
Yeah.
we had no say about it as long as they had
Yeah.
the right access.
Yeah, the federal sort of area of airports can include things like billboards on the way to an airport, and it can include like retail outlets within an airport and everything like that. It's basically an airport, and local governments can't regulate. So it's quite interesting. This next one, so we don't allow a use partially or totally in a tent trailer, motorhome, camper, other recreational vehicle. And we have an exception. We say it's temporary sleeping accommodation for non-paying visitors. And so I had it flagged as a change to potentially include on a residential property to temporary sleeping accommodation. And then we've had, like BYLAWS had examples in the past of it being on a commercial property, and we say, well, that's not quite the intent of it. It's meant to be for like visitors coming to stay as opposed to
Worker bees.
non-paying people staying on the property. So the next one is we have this regulation.
I'm confused. Are you now saying you're gonna allow somebody to rent a trailer on their property?
No, so currently we allow it. We allow
If you're
non-paying
building,
visitors.
If you're building.
There's a separate one for if you're building, and this one is just you can use it. Which essentially is like when you think about it, it's guests coming to stay with you can stay in their RV for up to 90 days in 360 period. We would say that can only be done on a residential property, so not a commercial property where there's no residential use, but it's supposed to be visitors coming to stay.
Oh, so you're gonna limit it to only half
Yeah.
of the residential?
Yeah. So we have a regulation that accessory buildings or structures can't be less than 1.8 meters from a principal building or 1.2 meters from another accessory building or structure. And this one gets weird because we then say if your buildings are 3 meters apart, it can be connected by a covered walkway. So we'll say to people, either you need to move it closer together sometimes, or accessory buildings closer together or connect them, or they have to be further apart, or they can be that close, but they need to be connected by like the roof lines need to be totally connected, or they need to be totally apart.
Yeah,
Because weird things where we end up driving people to move their sheds further apart from each other. They want to build a shed next to each other, or 2 feet away from each other, and we say, well, either you need to make it all one shed, or you need to move them apart. And
So you're saying it doesn't make sense?
It doesn't, yeah, I've never found it productive. Like, I know part of the reason for it is sort of building code considerations, but I would be more comfortable just saying about the building code when you get your permit. If you're close together, there may be building code implications you need to address through your permit, but then, and not just be an outright land use bylaw regulation.
So you're just gonna remove the 1.8 meters and the 1.2 meters?
Yeah.
That does, the other definition, building still stays, if it's less than 3 meters apart and connected by a covered walkway. That stays in there? So it still becomes all one building?
Yeah. So we have this section that's 3.18 to 3.23 that's about setbacks from water courses.
That one has nest trees.
Yeah, and so I'm not recommending removal, but I think when we adopted the water course development permit area, this was sort of never considered at the same time, and so some of them get weird where we say we can't build anything within it, and then we say, but you need a development permit to build within it. And so the development permit ends up sort of varying this by definition, because we say, well, if you're within 30 meters of a water course, you need a development permit, but you can't build anything, but you can get a development permit to build within it, and then, so then it varies, because you've got the environmental steps.
So you want to simplify it?
Simplify.
Yeah.
Not simply?
Yes. And then we have a whole section of our land use bylaw that's about
Can I
setbacks.
just,
Yeah.
where is it? Are you on page, well, anyway, there's something in there about nest trees and then there's nothing in the, it's in the setbacks,
Okay.
to water, but it says nest trees, but it doesn't say anything about it in the, yeah, it's in the title, where it says section 3.18 to 3.23, setbacks from water courses, water reservoirs, lakes, wetlands, and nest trees.
So that's the section of the land use bylaw.
Okay, so we're just not proposing any changes to the nest tree part?
I was just saying that whole section I would want to look at in
Okay.
relation to the development permit guidelines.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I just was confused.
Yes, so you're not voting to remove all regulations about next year. Yeah. So setback exceptions, so we have this whole list of things that, this one is about things that project into the setbacks, and so we recommend amending the list. So, so one thing is we allow things like bay windows and chimneys to be within the setback. We would have a maximum length that could be within it for like a bay window. And some of it would be just redoing the list. So things like eaves and gutters should be with roof overhangs and not, whether they're separate, I don't know, because they're the same thing. So then there's a couple things that are exempt within the setback. So one is landscaping pond, which are undefined and unrestricted in size. So staff would recommend including some sort of regulations on landscaping pond. This is what is the maximum size that it's going to be in the setback. And then retaining walls are currently permitted up to 2.5 meters in height anywhere on the lot. So staff recommend that this exception not apply to setbacks from the sea or water courses, and recommend that the exception be reduced in height so that retaining walls within a setback may have a maximum height of 2 meters. So 2.5 meters is 8'4".
Yeah.
So it's quite large. So currently on Bowen, anywhere up within the setback to the sea, you can have an 8'4" retaining wall, or multiple 8'4" retaining walls across your property. Find it, it's all, yeah, quite extreme. And then just in general, having a 2.5 meter retaining wall can be quite large to go up onto the setback right immediately next to the neighboring property. Yeah, so we recommend the changes.
So this says 2 meters, the written report I'm looking at says 1.5.
So that may have come from, again, this presentation came from when I went to the APC, and I believe the APC recommended 1.5.
That's right.
I am trying to confuse you, Allison. Yeah.
I'm gonna get that by Allison.
Yeah, no.
There you go, it's not gonna happen.
So currently we have this exception for accessory buildings and structures that don't exceed a height of 2.5 meters and not more than 10 square meters in the floor area may be sited at 0 meters from a lot line, subject to other things. So essentially, as you think about it, is like your woodshed exception that can go up to your property line. What I've often been concerned about is that it's defined by floor area. So technically, you know, if you built a carport that has a roof but no walls, it doesn't have a floor area by definition. And I thought about, does that mean you actually allow a carport? Could somebody say, well, it's bigger than this, but it doesn't have a floor area, it's just about height, it should be allowed up to the setback. So I'd like to have something that says it's about footprint of it as well as floor area.
Okay.
So this is visibility. So we have the setback that from a highway would be 4.6 meters from a highway, except in the village commercial zones. So this setback applies even when a zone may have a front setback of less than 4.6 meters. So the zone may say you can be 3 meters from the front lot line, but then this one would say, but you have to be 4.6 meters from the highway. And people never see it because it's not in their zone, they're just in their zone, and then they say, oh, by the way. So I'd recommend either amending every zone with a setback less than 4.6 meters from the front line to say, despite section 3.30, you do this, which is what we've done on recent land use bylaws, or we would amend section 3.30 to say, you know, except in these zones or something, or the front setback is less than this, or some way to word it exempts. Because it's supposed to be if you're, you know, if your side lot line, but you're in a SR2 zone where the side is 3 meters, but that's the road, you actually still have to be 4.6 from the road.
So just to clarify it all for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in our sign bylaw section, our sign bylaw section is sort of vague in terms of what signs can and can't be allowed. And so one thing that comes up is like contractor signs, so like house painting, fence construction, whatever it may be, comes up, right? And right now, our sign bylaw doesn't really say what we don't allow, but it says, or what we do allow, but it says, well, we don't allow a sign which advertises or pertains to a business, service, or activity which is discontinued for 30 days or more. So this is supposed to be, I think, it's kind of like, well, you run a bed and breakfast, but now you close the bed and breakfast. After 30 days, you have to take your sign down. But we've taken it to mean, okay, if you've got a contractor sign up, they can go up, because it's happening, but after the service is discontinued, you need to take the sign down.
Yeah.
But so we would like to amend the land use bylaw so that's a little more clear that that's a category that's captured by that.
Temporary signs.
Yeah.
So Daniel, I guess the worry would be that somebody starts putting up advertisements, let's frankly see the fencing and leaves it up there for 3-4 years, right? So we don't want that obviously.
Yeah, or even like, so maybe it's like a landscaping company, maybe they have a contract, so they're there every month. So then it's like, well, can the sign stay
Property
up
maintained by.
all the time,
Yeah.
right? Because
Nice.
they've never discontinued it, yeah.
Okay, good.
And then, so for development permits to be valid, they must be designated in an OCP, and then they must contain guidelines in either an OCP or a zoning bylaw. So our land use bylaw currently has guidelines for development permit at Cape Roger Curtis that's no longer in our OCP. So there's this whole section of our land use bylaw that exists but has no power or authority, so we recommend removing the guidelines. So that was removed, I guess, in our last OCP. We no longer have the development guidelines for Cape Roger Curtis. Yeah.
That's it. Anybody have any issues with that?
All right. So, so this is 2.3?
And the recommendation is that the committee of the whole direct staff for amendment, sorry?
I'll move that.
Okay, thank you. Second?
You put in the bit about council? That's it.
I'll second it, and
I seconded it. I was
okay,
seconded.
okay, you can second it. Yeah,
I
I'm
was
not
seconded.
Okay,
Carried over.
so any further discussion? These are all good things that they've done a lot of thinking about it and going to shorten,
Oh, it's
save
great.
a whole bunch
House
of work.
clean.
All in favor? Thank you. Allison?
Well, I don't like a lot line, front lot line.
No, I think it's a standard what sort of voter path. So are you in opposition?
Well, I'm not happy with some of them. That's my problem. I think that some of these things need to be addressed, but I'm not sure that I'm happy with the solution.
All this does is
You can be in opposition.
direct council to prepare an amendment bylaw.
Okay, well, I'll
Lots
have
of
to look at it.
process. AM opposed.
In or out?
I haven't said no.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just not sticking my hand.
It's unanimous. And, okay, so the last one, now this one I think we can do pretty quickly, right?
So, I mean,
Sorry,
I have a
Dave.
presentation, but essentially it's the same time that I brought it in November. It's the same presentation. Since then, I took council's comments from the meeting and after the meeting and revised the bylaw based on that.
Yeah.
And I also incorporated then we currently have a delegation bylaw that delegates the authority to issue development permits from council to the CAO.
Right.
And so I've included those provisions in this draft bylaw. So given the time, I'm really hesitant to go through this, but this is essentially
Has everybody had a read through it? We've already done one round of
Yep.
this.
Yep.
Is everybody happy with what's in there?
I have some questions.
Okay.
I'm trying
fine.
There was some typos, I remember.
Yeah, I'll forget about the typo.
Okay.
5.2,
Of the bylaw?
yeah, never mind.
Okay.
An application must be completed in the fourth year, which is then submitted with such additional plans. The application is considered accepted when all the including. And my question is, who decides what is required? Now, is the required attachments the items in the schedule, or is it something else?
I mean, I think it's the attachments in the schedule, so it's saying you need to provide the,
Will then say attachments as per schedule, blah. Otherwise, people, it leaves the implication that you could get something more. So then, a process question in the processing of applications, the ones for bylaws. There's nothing sort of in here about maybe referring to other municipal staff, external agency and so forth. At what point does it come forward to council to decide if they're even interested in going further with it? I don't see
Yeah.
that in there. So that was,
yeah.
yeah. And then I've got the same concerns I had with the independent review. You know, why are we asking for an independent review?
I mean, I think what the bylaw does is give us the option to ask for an independent review.
I know, but why would the manager ask for one? I mean, could we not solve the problem? If you would only ask for it because you don't understand what's being said, so you need help understanding. So that's more what I call professional assistance. Or you don't like the report and you don't trust it. And we could have gotten around that in the first place by having mutual agreement as to who is going to be, and agreeing on the terms of reference being given to the consultant and agreeing on who the consultant's going to be.
I mean, I think doing that is a much larger, like, change from the get-go in terms of, like, right now for development permits, generally, you know, people have seen the requirements, they'll have contracted the QEP, and they'll come for the application with the report initially. So there's no, like, initial step where we go through and we say, okay, these are people who hired and we agreed with it, and we work out the terms of reference for the project. Instead, you know, they submit the environmental report, and then we have questions, we go back to the QEP on the report, but we don't need that initial, like, back and forth before they even do the report to apply for the development permit.
But for rezonings and other things.
Yeah, I mean, for
They
rezoning,
don't
there's more
usually do those.
flexibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I still have problems with the cost and everything else. There's something missing in draft of bylaw amendments. Upon written request by the applicant prior to the last, the council may extend the deadline by passing a resolution to that effect to enable the applicant to complete, and then it stops.
To complete.
Complete what?
Complete.
Or to complete the application, or complete the reports, or, I think,
Yeah.
maybe that's not a typo. Whole bunch of cross references that need to be,
So,
Well, I was just gonna move the motion.
okay. Second.
Can I move it?
Sure.
well, my only other major one is 717, and it's the fact that the applicant's required to hold the meeting and everything, and
Correct,
I'm
yeah.
happy with that.
Yeah.
I think that's important. But I'm concerned about the fact that it's the applicant that's doing the minutes. How do we know that they've accurately,
Right.
you know,
I mean-
reported everything? I mean, you know, accounted for everything, or they left out comments that they don't really want us to have. I
Yeah.
mean, the staff's at the meeting, but it's not necessarily saying that staff's at the meeting, so maybe there's some way to tidy it up to.
I think I wanted knowing that, like, staff may agendas may attend, and like assuming that we would be attending and would be, but
Yeah.
that it's almost like, so the applicant's aware of like, these are the requirements that we're gonna expect of you, we're gonna expect you to listen to things and be able to give us a summary.
Yeah, some wording that, you know, that it's not sort of a quick reading summary that they try and remember afterwards, if there's somebody there actually taking
Yeah,
notes or minutes or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if there was staff was there, I mean, if there's gonna be a whole bunch of comments and that sort of thing.
yeah, so I have in here that like,
Analysis,
municipal staff would collect comment sheets and would attend
Oh,
as
okay.
observers and
Yeah.
respond to questions.
Okay,
I think I just wanted the applicant to be aware sort of that the expectation is that they're like,
They're
it's like putting the things up, but they're like listening and they're gonna be able to tell them
Yes.
afterwards what
Yeah.
people said.
yeah.
But that municipal staff would still play a role in that as well.
Well, as long as municipal staff, maybe we should emphasize that a little bit.
Well, I think, no, that part was clear.
It's there.
Yeah.
It's more that he's got somebody competent taking minutes or
Yeah.
notes. You
Well,
know,
that's when you get staff there.
well, no, we don't pay staff. They're gonna have to provide the proper notes of what went on at the meeting.
You might have to have something in there about standards of minutes, you mean?
Yeah, or just, yeah, it's just something about, submit a report, location and time, how the meeting was advertised, but they don't sort of, you know,
And meetings, minutes, such
got
a
minute
standard.
paper or something that,
Yeah.
yeah, it just implies that they can't just sit down afterwards over a beer and make some notes.
Right.
Can you do a little work on that part?
I can look at that, yeah.
Thank you.
First, I just want to say that I do support being able to ask for independent review, and because I think that's important if there's a question. And I also, I'll just make the motion. That committee of the whole recommend to council that they direct staff to bring bylaw 494, 2019 to council for consideration of first reading.
Okay, Allison, you're seconding that?
Yeah, no, then we're not saying he can't make some changes
No.
to what's there.
Yeah, I respect that. I was gonna say, you know, this isn't like top of my list, but I'm open for any changes from council if you notice anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, like typos or clarification, I can look at it.
Yeah,
before it comes back.
that's understood. Okay, so we've got it first and seconded. I just want to say, I just want to make sure everybody's comfortable here because we're sort of rushing this through, but I read through it top to bottom and I didn't see any problems. Allison, those are items that maybe need a little bit of cleaning up, which I was going to attend to. I'll ask the question, all in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you very much, everybody. The meeting is adjourned, so we'll get it. A little late. Thank you very much, Daniel. I hope that clears up a whole bunch of stuff for you.
That's great to see
Well,
it
nobody
progressing.
asked you how much time doing all of this is going to take compared to and what it's going to do to the workflow for, you know, people that
Yeah.
do things so they can get their building